So good morning and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our final session of this week's Responsible Raw Materials Conference. Thank you so much to those of you who have dialed in yet again to catch us live for this week's sessions. And welcome, let me just mute that. There we go. You can see that YouTube is working and we have about a 20-second lag there to all of you who are there on YouTube. But welcome everybody and welcome to those attendees who are busy dialing in now and to all of our lovely speakers who are here and raring to go to share all of their wonderful thoughts and perspectives. This is the final time this week that I shall do the housekeeping for those of us who are on Zoom. So attendees, you will see down at the bottom of your screen, three fantastic buttons that will be useful for you. You will have a chat function, so feel free to make use of that and send through your comments and questions and queries to all of the lovely panelists throughout the session. You will also see that there's a little raise hands button. So if you're having any problems, click on that and you will see a lovely little blue hand appears next to your name, and either Rose or myself will come and help you. And finally, you have a Q&A button. And so if you click on that, you can ask everybody some questions and generate some debate here within the Zoom environment. For those of you who are watching on YouTube, you guys will see that you actually have some live chat there. And what we found is some really interesting discussions being undertaken during the course of the sessions over the last 5 days. So please do feel free to ask us questions, engage in discussion through that as well. If Zoom or YouTube is not your thing and you prefer email, you can also ask us questions by emailing us at hello@responsiblerawmaterials.com. Some of you have sent in some fantastic emails over the past week and we've been able to bring them into discussion. So thank you very much for that. The final two channels that we'll go through, we also have Twitter, and of course, there's lots of chatter going on LinkedIn as well. So please do feel free to get in touch. All perspectives are very welcome, and we're keen to see what everybody thinks responsibility should look like within raw materials as a whole. Now, those of you who have been attending over the course of the last week will see that we have gone through a very wide range of different talks. By the end of this morning, I think we will have listened to 72 speakers. We will have had 61 speaking slots over the course of many hours of free online streaming. So for any of you who haven't caught the conference over the last week, don't worry, your weekend is now set and planned because you have a whole weekend's worth of streaming TV, because I suspect you've run out of things to watch on Netflix or whatever other platforms you may like to get your television from. So feel free to catch up with us on that. Final bits and pieces to say are around, you will find all of our lovely abstracts, etc., and background to our attendees by going to the website. So if I just share my screen now, you will see that the website is www.responsiblerawmaterials.com, and you'll find lots of information that's being collated together on the website. Key areas for you guys to go to today are, if you go to the abstracts tab, you will see that in here we have all of the wonderful abstracts that have been sent in by our speakers. And to find those abstracts for our speakers that we have with us this morning, if you just click on Friday morning, because I'm sitting here in the UK, so my apologies, everything is in UK timing. So Darren, who I know is dialing in from Riyadh, you know what the time zone difference is, and you'll be able to do the maths to work out where we are and what we're up to. So what you will see here is you'll see all of the abstracts from everybody this morning. And if you click on those, you will see that it takes you into all of the information about that presenter together with a bit of a biography for them as well. You will also see down the bottom a donate now button, and if you click on that, you'll go to our Virgin Money giving site, and you'll see that we have been gently collecting some fantastic funds for some awesome charities, all of whom have focused initiatives with regards to either responsible raw materials or COVID-19, because of course that is very topical at this precise moment in time. So thank you very much to all of you who have been donating away. We're going to leave that that money giving site open for at least another week or so, just to collect in some more funds for those great charities. The final thing to note is if I go back to all posts and I go and find Monday sessions, you will see that what we've begun to do is we've begun to embed the videos from the live talks into the abstracts. And so what this is producing for us is a nice central repository for all of the information that we've been putting together over the course of the last week, that's really easy to sort through and to find some of the talks that you might be interested in seeing. We know that hundreds of you have been watching the live stream on YouTube after the event is finished and being able to compare and contrast between the schedule and the talks so you can find specific talks. But this additional level of editing should hopefully make it a little bit easier for you as well. What some of our speakers have also done is share some additional resources with us as well. So for example, Christopher was kind enough to share with us the script that he used to guide his talk that he gave all the way back on Monday when we first started this conference. So you'll have some extra resources there for you. The final thing that I would like to just share with you is last night, when we finished yesterday afternoon session, we set everybody a challenge. And that challenge was based on some of the inspiration from Murray Hitzman's talk that he gave yesterday afternoon, and more specifically by some of the research from Anthea Lachia from ICRAG. And what Anthea has been doing is trying to get under the skin of the perspectives of mining from different people. And what she's been doing is asking people to draw a picture of what they think a mine looks like. Now, we did some of this overnight, and of course, we set you the challenge to draw a picture and send in what you think a mine looks like. And we've called this is a working title, so Our Mine Perspectives, or Mine Our Perspectives, building on, again, some of what Mark Rakavides shared with us yesterday in terms of his insights. And what you can see here is some fantastic drawings have been coming in, and it's absolutely brilliant trying to work out, okay, who is this person that's drawn this picture, and what is their experience, how do they see the world, etc. And what you can begin to do is say, okay, the person who drew this picture, are they a geologist? Are they an engineer? Are they an economist, a regulator? Do they have any technical experience in mining? In this array that you see in front of you, we also have a 12-year-old who has a passion for Minecraft. So there'll be prizes to guess who is who. As you can see, we're gently building all of these slides as we go. And it's a case here where what we will do by the end of today's session is try and collate even more of your pictures that you're still sending in now. I can see another one's just come in this second, so thank you very much for that. And we'll be able to use this in our summary roundup at the end of this morning. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to take up any more of this slot because I'm going to pass straight across to the wonderful Darren. So Darren, if you want to come off mute and begin to share your slides. Darren is coming to us from Riyadh. So it is a Friday with Darren, which means that actually it is technically speaking your weekend. So thank you so much for dialing into us today. And as you can see, Darren is going to share with us his talk coming from quite a different perspective, which is around sustainable infrastructure. What is my risk? Darren, over to you.
Quick comms check. Can you hear me?
We can indeed. Thanks,
That's
sir.
Great. So first of all, many thanks to both Sarah and Rose for organising this amazing initiative, and secondly, just giving me the opportunity just to say a few words to kick off today. So as Sarah has said, I'm probably coming at this from a different angle. I'm probably going to maybe give people some food for thought as we go through the remaining presentations today about maybe different perspectives and sort of some of the questions to ask. In terms of content, I've got a little bit of structure here in terms of the scale of the problem through to a little bit talking about some of the risks, both the sources of the risks and some of the impacts. So a little bit about me. So I've been quite fortunate to have worked sort of across a few different sectors over the years, but I would say it's probably the last 20 of those years where I've very much worked on infrastructure, in particular project management, risk management, and project controls. And as Sarah said, so most of my career Up until the last 2 years, it's been in the UK, and then last 2 years here in Saudi Arabia as well. Fellow few institutes, and my angles today. So I was the chair of the Institute of Risk Management in London. So I was chair of their infrastructure risk group. So hence I've a particular interest in this subject, and also I've gone back to school. So I'm currently studying a master's at University of Surrey, and the first module I picked was sustainable infrastructure. So it's quite a passion for mine. And it's interesting to offer some insights today. The picture, so on the top right, this is quite an important picture for me because this completely changed my opinion on a lot of the topics I'll talk about. So behind you is a border checkpoint, and on the other side of that is Yemen. So about 18 months ago, I spent a little bit of time in Yemen looking at some infrastructure projects, what the purpose of them are, how they were being built, and it completely changed. You know, when you're looking at something from a leafy suburb in the UK versus looking at something sort of in a dusty patch of sand in Yemen, it opens your eyes as well. So we'll probably touch on that a little bit as well. So the problem, I won't spend a lot of time on this. You've all pretty much gone through, but some scary stuff. So over the last 70 years, 30% of the world's arable land has become unproductive due to erosion. We move we move more sediment and rock annually, and all natural processes. So as you can start to see some of the link now into sort of raw materials and what we use and how we extract them. And also as well, you know, again, greenhouse gases at crazy levels. Moving on, moving probably a little bit more into the sort of infrastructure, you sort of, this particular one at the bottom, there's lots of different ways of measuring, but a key thing, this is quite important, is still the emissions or the impact from the use of infrastructure is way more than the actual construction of it. And although that will change over time, as you'll see, this is something quite important, and you'll see this come up as well. So how we use our infrastructure is probably many times more important than how we actually build it as well. Some of the priorities. So you'll have seen this before, and I think up behind Sarah, up on her wall, you recognize it. The sort of 17 Sustainable Development Goals from the UN, and it's a nice, pretty picture. Everything looks symmetrical and uniform, and it looks easy, doesn't it? And if you go on website, you'll hear about the decade of action from 2020 to 2030. Act now. So we've got these 17 things, these goals, and we need to take action and act now. But I sometimes, and this goes back, and go back to sort of my trip to Yemen, I've looked at it from a different angle, and you hear about the 3 pillars, and you hear about at the top, the economic pillar, then the social pillar in the middle, and the sort of the environmental pillar. And suddenly when you split the 17 goals apart, you can start to see tensions, potential tensions or conflict between some of them. So if I focus on one particular set of goals, that might be at the risk of achieving some others, in fact making some others worse. And this is something quite important, is this is not easy, and sometimes, you know, these are not all nice 17 pretty uniform goals. Some of them sort of are sort of at the risk of others as well. So what are some of these sources of risk? And I've set it out in a series of questions, and when you see them, you'll quickly detect the structure. So if you think about it in terms of sort of some of the sources of risk, so when we start to build something, do we need it? Should we build it? What should we build? Moving on, where should we build it? How we build it, how we operate it and maintain it, and finally dispose it. So you can see over the full course of a asset life, from concept all the way through to disposal, we are introducing sources of risk. Some of the decisions we make are introducing risk to infrastructure. And the key link in terms of materials, you know, you could ask, when you suddenly look at these questions from the lens of raw materials, again, these are quite important decisions. Also as well, to think about it, it's not as simple as just asking questions, but also the stakeholders. So we've touched on this. So the opinion or viewpoint of the owner of the asset may be very different from the financier, the user as well. So again, going back, remember we talked about tensions and the 17 goals. You know, so if you somebody who's more focused on the economic impact of infrastructure, maybe over the environmental and vice versa. So again, this is quite important. And time. This time over time, your perceptions and the impacts will change over time. We're building for today, and we'll calculate the emissions today. What about into the future as well? So something that might be a poor choice or bad choice today in terms of raw material might be a good choice in the future, and vice versa. So something as well to think about. Moving on, so we got those questions at the top, you'll see, and I've tried to focus in, because of time, on a couple of them, sort of how we build and operate and maintain some of our infrastructure. And I've picked security of supply as a sort of a key impact. And if you think about raw materials, and particularly rare earth materials, it's a key issue. Is where do we get them, and how do we continue to get them sustainably into the future? You hear phrases about rare earth elements and metals are now the new oil. It's a little bit ironic, sort of from where I am at the minute. But if you think like China, we're seeing this summer, China apparently controls roughly 90% of these materials. And also things like sand. We think about sort of rare materials as it be these special elements or metals, but even materials like sands are becoming particularly rare, scarce in some parts of the world as well. So why is this relevant today? And if you bring the link in today, and we've seen at the bottom, you'll see the virus, we've got COVID. And if you think about COVID, you think, well, what's COVID got to do with this? Some of the impacts of COVID around supply, if you think around supply around the world, was massive, has been massively disrupted and continues to be in terms of our infrastructure. Think about some of the construction projects, getting materials in, and also think about operations and maintenance, disruption of that because maybe getting certain materials in from certain parts of the world, and hence the link back into China. If key materials have come from a particular part of the world that has been shut down, it's a similar impacts in the future if there was a different type, if it was think about economic, think about the goals, if there was an economic source of risk, you think about trade controls, trade wars, social as well, in terms of not supplying to certain countries, same impact. And the so what from that is about, hence link back to risk, is when you think about all of these things is who actually owns the risk. And if you think about sometimes with infrastructure, we think we've transferred the risk to the EPC contractor who's going to build my infrastructure, and possibly into, if I have a long life design, build and operate contract, I think I've transferred my risk. And whether it's FIDIC Silver Book or FIDIC Gold Book, I think I've transferred my risk, but have I really? Yeah. So just sort of a few points just to wrap up. So I've kept this quite brief. Is, you know, when you think about sustainable infrastructure, and in particularly the supply of materials and raw materials into the sustainable infrastructure, you've seen the numbers. We have to do something quickly. But actually, most of the short-term positive effect can be delivered through how we use infrastructure rather than how we build, operate, and maintain it. At the same time, we have to balance these pillars. We spoke about the environmental goals, the social goals, economic, and sometimes they conflict with each other, again, depending which stakeholder type you are, and over time as well. So we have to balance these. And ultimately, a lot of the decisions comes down to who owns the risk, and actually who's willing to pay for the mitigation. Yeah, that's quite important. A lot of the decisions come down to that. And when it comes to risk, we spoke about not just the what, but the who's impacted, what their perception is, and the when over time as well. And this is something as well we have to remember is what I think is a risk might be somebody else's opportunity. So if I think extracting raw materials or building some infrastructure in a particular location is a bad thing, for economic reasons and social reasons, for that part of the world, that might be a massive opportunity, and we should recognize that. And then finally, it's not easy, is it? It's balancing all of these things. So just a different perspective, a different viewpoint, and hopefully some of the slides will provoke some questions later on as we go through the presentations. And then finally, I think I'm okay over time, is sort of any non-technical questions. Don't ask me anything technical. Cool. So that's me done, Sarah. So I will hand back to you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Darren, for sharing your perspectives from infrastructure, which is absolutely crucial, because there's no point in mining many of the materials that many people on this call do on a day-to-day basis if nobody's going to use them. And of course, a great deal of those materials are used within construction infrastructure as a whole. Just one question, Darren, before we go on to our next speaker. And by the way, I know that you are going to be around for the duration of the session, so please, everybody, do pass your questions on to Darren online. You mentioned it's not necessarily a question of what is the risk, but who owns the risk. And I guess as well, depending on that person and their perspective, their interpretation of what the risk is, whether it's an opportunity or a threat. I don't know if you can maybe talk quickly to something about people owning risks, and so therefore what can they do about them?
And again, it's quite, if you think about the current situation, so within a lot of big infrastructure projects, there will be a contract form. So it's normally it's FIDIC, and FIDIC's really black and white as to who owns risk. And when it comes to maybe supply of materials, a lot of that risk is transferred away from the owner or the person who's financing the project or infrastructure to a third party, the contractor. And we think it's clear. We sit back and I've transferred my risk, and then stuff happens. You know, if you think about it, you know, what if there was another major event and it was around scarcity? If I'm operating and maintaining an asset with 100-year life expectancy, and suddenly a particular rare metal or rare element or something goes wrong somewhere around the world, is we think I've transferred that risk to the person who's going to build or operate my infrastructure, but it all comes back to me. And I think that's the bit where this maybe COVID is recognized. So, and what's happening at the minute is there are cases where under the contract, yes, the risk was technically transferred to somebody else, but what's happening is people are using, going back to common law in the courts at the minute and saying, is that fair? Is that reasonable to transfer something that was so almost like the force majeure across? So it's just something to think about. Sometimes we think we've transferred the risk, but have we really? That's the key question.
Brilliant. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together to give Darren his round of applause from behind our silent microphones. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Darren. If Darren can please stop sharing your slides, and we'll bring online our next speaker, who is the wonderful Aldo Panini. So Aldo, now is your opportunity to come off mute and begin to share those slides that you have. And we're going to stick with this world of perceptions and perspectives. Aldo, over to your lovely self.
Good morning, Sarah, and everybody. It's nice to be part of this conference, a terrific conference. Listening in on the last few days, and the quality and diversity of presentations has been really, really impressive. Some of the themes that have been raised over the last few days, you probably see sprinkled through my presentation. And I guess a little bit of background. I've worked in the mining industry for about 12 years, studying in Australia in the coal sector for Anglo American, and then moving to London to work for Anglo, and then hopping on to the International Council on Mining and Metals to run their communications. I was fortunate enough to come in to the ICMM at a time when the industry was thinking about how it can better communicate with society. So I'll tell you a little bit about the story behind that, and then come back to this question about will perceptions of the mining industry matter post COVID-19. So it'll be some thoughts, some reflections that I welcome your comments on. Just to get started, the industry got a big wake-up call back in the late 90s, particularly some of the leading, the CEOs of some of the leading mining houses, where they were seeing perspectives or commentary from society, pressure from society, the environmental movement, which was gathering momentum, putting the spotlight on how mining was or wasn't performing in terms of sustainability. There was a famous conference at Davos where a group of CEOs were left kind of dumbfounded by the pushback they were receiving from a lot of the participants. That got them thinking about something needing to be done. And after a fair bit of work in terms of stakeholder conversations and consultation, the ICMM was born to try and improve the sustainability performance of its members. And after a number of years, despite significant effort to improve that performance, at least in the eyes of the miners themselves, perceptions amongst the public and stakeholders in particular were not improving. And so as you can see on the screen, some of the contributors to that, from a basic point, negative imagery of mining, old, dangerous, destructive, the issue of coal, child labour, environmental impacts, you name it, governance, corruption. They're all themes and images that were floating around society and impacting on the reputation of the industry. And one of the reasons it matters to CEOs, of course, is because it has a material impact. If communities don't support your projects, they will be delayed or stopped. There are billions of dollars worth of stalled projects around the world that hasn't changed. If anything, it could be getting worse, particularly in places like Peru and other parts of Latin America. And as you all know, the investment community is paying a lot more attention to how companies deal with ESG, putting a value on it, and an outcome of that also is potential share price volatility. So very much front of mind in terms of risk to value. What we knew about stakeholder perceptions in this case back then, there was a study done by Globescan that you may be aware of back in 2014. And no surprises here that amongst the more than 1,200 stakeholders, ICMM stakeholders that is, that were engaged during that time and dispersed around the world in a range of sectors, from NGOs to academics, industry people themselves, trade unions, and people like ourselves in the consultancy advisory space. That's a social community acceptance were top of mind as key issues for the industry to address. Governance closely followed. Price, cost, pressures, volatility. It was a time when the industry was coming back from in a fairly shaky space. Stakeholders acknowledge that as well. So that's why that's there. Water usage creeping up the list, and environmental concerns, of course, also there. So that list may have changed somewhat in terms of ordering, but pretty much the same issues have been challenges for us for some time since. And what about the public? The ICMM also surveyed members of the public in these countries, Australia, Peru, Chile, USA, and Zambia. And interestingly, trust came up as the key driver of acceptance of the mining industry, driven by three primary factors. One is distributional fairness, so the benefits, sharing of the benefits of mining with society, and the perception that that is not happening or has not been happening. So communities not feeling that they were getting the jobs, the investments, the support of livelihoods that they felt that they deserved as a result of mining in their regions. Procedural fairness in terms of engagement and input into decision-making processes by society. There's a sense of opaqueness behind how decisions are made in terms of mining projects. And confidence in governance, which is linked to the second point around corruption, transparency, and integrity and credibility of government and its institutions. What was made clear also is that perceptions vary between countries and within countries themselves. So if you look at, for example, places like Australia and Peru, or even Canada. In Canada, you have, broadly speaking, and you know, there are variants, but society or Canadians being broadly supportive of their mining industry. Less so the case in Peru. particularly in mining communities themselves. And a mixed story in Australia. In Australia in particular, there's a divide between how urban Aussies regard the industry and how people in rural and regional areas, particularly around mining towns, see the mining industry. Obviously more supportive in those regional centres. Also, another point here is, while individual mining companies may be well perceived in different parts of the world, the industry as a whole is not. So the challenge for mining companies is, well, we are investing all this money in promoting ourselves, but at the end of the day, that counts for little if the sector or the industry we're a part of is not well perceived. So the CEOs in this case, and I keep mentioning the CEOs, because one of the unique things about ICMM is it's a CEO-led organisation. So at the moment, you've got 27 of the world leading mining companies represented, and their CEOs turn up to the meeting. So the conversations that are being had at the council of the ICMM, you're only allowed to have CEOs there. So they've challenged themselves and the organisation itself to better tell the story. And part of the challenge I was confronted with is going about how do we do that? The mining industry had never run a communications campaign, a global communications campaign. We barely communicated as an industry. We tend to sort of be shy of putting our head above the parapet for fear of getting it lopped off. So what I'm providing you with here is a bit of a helicopter view of what we did. And I'll come back to the post-COVID perception question towards the end. The approach we took had as a central objective an influencing influencers approach, which we've heard about earlier in the week. This was very much, we put in place a campaign to test what could or wouldn't work in terms of shifting public perceptions. We saw the shifting of those perceptions as a long-term goal, and as a way of getting there, targeting some of these influencers. And by influencers, we mean sort of NGOs, media, academia, investors, and in the case of Peru, where we did a deep dive, citizens themselves. The core message we applied was mining with principles, largely based on ICMM's 10 principles. But one of the sort of key reasons also for applying that is that we wanted the campaign not to be a one-way information share, but to spark a conversation with society by posing questions around what responsible mining might look like, combined with some good examples of how we're going about it. And we felt that mining with principles is something that the industry was aspiring to, but would help us generate the discussion. So the approach we took very quickly, we had a couple of broad phases. The first one of the campaign, and it ran over about 18 months, was to raise awareness of what everyday products are made of and how those products are mined responsibly. We then transitioned that in the second part of the campaign, into the telling of beneficiary stories, those people in the communities in which we operate, how they've been benefiting from the presence of mining, whether in terms of jobs, impact on environment and ethical practices. We targeted 5 countries, although a global campaign, because it had a social media component, but also traditional media, which obviously is by its nature global. But we tended to, we also focused on 5 jurisdictions to see what would work in those. So it's Australia, Canada. In Peru, we did a deeper dive where we went into a couple of communities in southern Peru, Arequipa and Cusco, where there is a significant mining presence, to see how our messaging might resonate there around mining with principles, in Spanish, of course. The UK and the US were also included, UK, particularly London, as a centre of influence, where many of the NGOs and thought leaders in the space are based and drive opinion. Similarly, in the US, we were focused more on New York. Interestingly, we had to drop the US because we got a lot of pushback. This was the time when Trump had been elected, and there was a lot of sensitivity about the mining industry going in with a different story than what was expected, one that focused on sustainability and how mining could improve its performance. So we were compelled to drop that, unfortunately. and then an opportunity for the members of ICMM to lead by example. This is a splash of a lot of the campaigns that were underway by companies and associations. They range, as you can see in the top line. There was a campaign in Australia promoting coal, to the green whale of the Canadian Mining Association on the left. So quite a disparate set of messages getting out there, all focused on particular audiences, but no overarching narrative for the sector to project. And that's what we tried to do as a collective. Our online presence, we set up a website with all the content we were producing, and you've got the link there. I'd encourage you to sort of scroll through that, because it's filled with case studies of the work that members do, stories from local communities. A lot of content was developed for this campaign, and put on there. CEOs were involved as well, which was a very encouraging thing. As I said, this is just examples of the imagery that we put out there. We had mobile phones, everyday products like chairs, bicycles, posing a question. This was all on social media, posing a question whether this, is this mined responsibly, or is this produced responsibly? Is this produced ethically? The idea with the question was to spark that interest and engagement from the audiences. Again, here an image of one of the beneficiary stories we ran in Peru. America established their own business in Arequipa with the support of one of the ICMM companies that was developing a copper mine. Changed her life and that of the little community around her in a very poor part of Arequipa. There's a video about her that we went out and we filmed and put online, which ran very well, was well received in the local community. And also CEOs, so we filmed a number of the member CEOs to get their perspectives on what they felt, in this case, ethical business was about. You've got there Tanya Constable from the Minerals Council of Australia, sharing her very personal perspectives on what mining with principles is about. Graham Kerr, as you can see down below. So these are also very well received, and an interesting challenge to get the CEOs to talk about what they felt as people, not just as CEOs, in terms of responsible or mining with principles. So the key takeaways of the short campaign is that we were able to establish a compelling narrative for the industry for the first time. Now, mindful, many of those, if not all of you, may not have heard about this campaign. And as I said, it was targeted at particular audiences with limited budget, although an enhanced budget by ICMM standards, but focusing mainly on those audiences that, broadly speaking, did not have a positive view of mining or do not know about mining. We weren't trying to preach to the converted, but instead engage in a conversation with our critics. It is possible to shift perceptions. The case in Peru was very encouraging. Just as a side note, we did a radio campaign there because the penetration of social media is very limited. And we ran these local beneficiary videos and pushed the message of mining with principles. Very good receptiveness in the place like Arequipa, where the local community can see and feel the benefits of mining more than other places. Different story in Cusco, where those benefits were not perceived as in Arequipa, and there was a greater prevalence of activism in that community. So we were able to get data about the types of conversations that were being had around the dinner table in particular homes. That's a level of detail we were able to get into, and gave us some really good feedback on how to approach different regions. And more broadly, global stakeholder feedback was positive, because we weren't trying to greenwash or put out sort of propaganda, but instead engage in a sort of more humble conversation about acknowledging the challenges, but also putting forward the approach these companies are seeking to take to improve performance around these principles. So another key takeaway, ongoing commitment by the CEOs. They said, this is important, we need to keep doing it. And that's still ongoing. And that content is king. Without the right material, these campaigns are puff. They need to be backed up by performance on the ground. And that is a message that was made very clear to all our members, and coming from within the membership as well. But some of the challenges, you're trying to have competitors, especially engaging in, speaking with a collective voice. That's easier said than done. Global campaigns are hard, they're expensive, they're highly complex, multi-layered. We're relying on different levels of capability in terms of enabling us to project the message amongst their members, and also getting buy-in from national commodity associations, as well as wider networks of those that are critical of the sector. Very challenging. And as I said earlier, adapting content to each country is a key, is critical. Just a couple of more slides. So back to the question, will public perceptions matter? The short answer is yes. And we've heard what some of those drivers might be. There's increasing societal expectations, communities not welcoming companies they don't trust. Customer demand for responsibility of sourced products will continue to grow. We've heard about that through the responsible sourcing presentations. We know that investors see this as a huge issue, and are putting numbers to it and holding companies to account. And companies themselves need to attract people and capital. And if they're not well regarded, that will not happen. And if they don't perform well, that will not happen. An emerging trend going forward is ESG being a point of differentiation among companies, as they see it as a value creating opportunity. But also, I would argue, a point of potential competitive space looking forward. The more value that you're able to generate and attract, the more you want to differentiate yourself. And in closing, I hope you can see the full slide. I've got sort of a number of heads on the right of my screen, but in summary, ESG will remain front of mind for CEOs for a long time. These are people that are meant to be looking 5-10 years ahead, and what they see is a world that wants them to be more responsible. The top two issues that are consistently put to the ICMM by the CEOs themselves that they worry about, apart from safety, are community relations and water. Those are the things that may not keep them awake at night, but certainly are front of mind when they run their businesses. And as we're all sort of finding out, or as we assess the impact of COVID, one of the things that seems to be emerging is that governments and corporations will be thinking more about purpose, more about people's well-being, partly as a way of building on the trust that they may have gained as a result of their response to the pandemic, or having to rebuild as a result of how poorly they've dealt with the pandemic. Either way, I would argue that we're moving into a space where there'll be a bit more caring and sharing. I know others may see very differently. That's my sense. The good news is that perceptions can be shifted. It takes time to get cut through, but ongoing commitment is important, along with clear, compelling narrative backed by performance. So all the presentations we've had this week are about improving performance, and that's critical. The job of people like me in comms cannot be done without that work being carried out on the ground and being able to be backed up. Also, as I said earlier, an ongoing willingness of the industry and the associations to collaborate. So working together doesn't come easy, let alone communicating together. That we also need to be able to attract high-profile champions. The industry, championing itself is not enough. We need to have third-party people vouch for their efforts and engage critical voices. That's critical. And one of the key messages, as I finish, from the CEOs has been, we don't want to keep preaching to the converted in the industry. We want to speak to the people that don't necessarily like us, but are willing to engage in a conversation. So finally, what can we as a collective do? Spark the conversation. This is a good start. Engage with the networks, ask the questions. As Nick pointed out yesterday or the day before, I think it was, engage with the media. If the BBC or others want to run a piece on public perceptions, speak about this stuff at events, at schools, universities, or wherever else you feel you have the ear of the audience. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Aldo. I think that gives us an absolutely fantastic insight to the International Council for Mining and Metals, which is crucial, especially for a whole myriad of different players in the mining sector. So thank you for that. In the interest of time, we're going to go straight on to our next speaker. However, Aldo, there are some brilliant questions that have come in from the likes of Zach, who's asking about, have you been able to quantify some of the perception value? And also Victor, who's talking about what was going on inside the ICMM, or what were the feelings inside the ICMM when there were big incidents such as tailings dam failures. But rather than ask you to answer them online right now, I'll push you to the written forum, and then we'll be able to bring that back into conversation later. So thank you very much, Aldo, and a big round of applause from all of us behind our muted microphones.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, just while we cross over to our new speaker, so Marco, now is your opportunity to unmute and then begin to share your slides. I know that Marco has been busy in the background during the few talks that we've had, and his son has been absolutely brilliant and sent in a picture of what his son thinks a mine looks like. So we will share that with you later. But without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Marco Komak, who's going to talk to us about the INFACT project. Marco, over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. Good morning to everybody, and thanks for inviting me to participate in this wonderful conference. It's something that reality looks upon us in the future, I guess, and it's much cheaper also. We don't need to spend money, but I do like to travel. Anyhow, my presentation is going to be about the INFACT project, which deals with a novel approach to mining exploration in Europe, and it's a rather vivid project from the partners' perspective, which you can see from the authors. And I come from the European Federation of Geologists as being one of the partner in the project. We've all seen that the world is facing huge challenges lately, and of course Europe is not an exception. And as Europe wants to shift to the energy transition activities, there's a huge rising demand on various materials, raw materials, and also metal alloys. And in addition to that demand, we are still rather low in recovery of the existing or already used materials, especially rare earth elements. And in addition to that, the mining in Europe is not very well appreciated. So Europe strongly depends upon the imports from other continents. And I've stumbled on this survey of European Commission. It's from 2013, but still it gives a good impression, a huge contradictory that rules in Europe, what people actually want and what people need. And if you see, in comparison to other industries, mining and gas companies rate really low. Only the bankers are worse than ourselves. So this is something that we need to take into account and to ask ourselves, what can we do to improve this image, to actually to improve, not approve, but to improve the image of mining and extraction industries. So giving that in mind, an idea was born and the consortium put together, which you can see on the right side of the slide. And the project was designed and submitted for the proposal, and luckily it got funded. So the INFACT was born, and the INFACT project looks at critical raw materials in Europe and also other rather quintessential elements, chemical elements that will help the energy transition that Europe is set upon. And the project is basically constructed of 3 pillars. And the first one is to support the development of some novel and non-invasive exploration techniques, then to include all relevant stakeholders in the process. And that means not only the industry and the general end users, but also the NGOs that we've been talking about in the past couple of days. And since we don't want to invent the wheel, we also are looking abroad to other continents, to other practices, to see what we can learn from them. And if we, my screen has gone down.
Are you able to?
You cannot move my slides, can you?
We can't, unfortunately, from here, Marco. Do you want to just keep talking through it? And what we can do for everyone is...
I'll just switch it like that.
Perfect.
Okay. So what is it all about within INFACT project? There are several objectives, and one objective is to establish a sort of physical laboratories in Europe. We call them reference sites, where the novel technology could be tested on the ground, but not only from the technical perspective, also from the social acceptance perspective, which is really important, because if you cannot start the exploration by using specific technologies, then there's no way you're going to open a mine, because you don't know what's there. So we've set up to establish 3 reference sites, and we wanted to cover geographically and socially representative areas, and of course, from geological perspective, also relevant areas where geology is very well known, because we want to test the technology on what we actually know and how good can we see with the new technology what we know. And there were 3 reference sites selected. One in Finland, that's the Sakati area. Another one is the Gaia area in Germany. And in Andalusia, in Spain, we have actually 2 sites, but they are close together. So we treat them as, let's say, one site. Then we want to establish a certification procedures, some sort of guidelines that those that want to test the technology will follow through, a sort of protocol. And with that, following the protocol in the right way, they would reach the credibility and also test the social acceptance of the technology within the local communities. And that's very important, as I said before. And at the end, in addition to those reference sites, we also set up ourselves a goal to develop or to draft a sort of white paper that would help the European Commission with the guidelines how to achieve the sustainable framework for mineral exploration in Europe, a sort of discovery map. And that's also very important output of the project. But what I want to show here in my presentation is an activity that we did back, that's already 2 years in the past, but it's very informative. And it goes sort of in line with what was just presented with Aldo's presentation, but it's more it's focused on Europe. It has less less participants. So altogether, we've interviewed 3,000, little above 3,000 people within all the 3 countries where we have the reference sites, and we asked them about their opinion about mining and exploration. And here are the results that we got. For all of those that are interested in the more detailed results, there's a link on the left bottom side of the slide where you can find the report. So what are just a couple of key facts that we've learned? We've asked people how important is the mining in their country, and now I will only go through the joint results, while here you can see that there are 4 bars. First one is a joint one, then the second one is Germany, the third one Spain, and the fourth one Finland. And you can see that if we see the people's perception of how important the mining is, almost half of them say that in their country mining is really important. And there's another quarter of them saying that they are quite neutral. They don't know whether it is or it's not important. And only only about a quarter of people fully disagree with this statement, and there are some people that don't have the opinion. And when we ask them how well does the mining treat the environmental impact, and we see the quite opposite replies. There's less than 1/5 of people that actually think that mining handles environmental issues really well. And there's another 1/5 of the people that are neutral about it. And there's more than half of people that think that mining is really bad for the environment. And then again, we have about 10% of people who have no opinion on that. And if we look at all questions that we post and sort of extract the public attitude in the 3 countries altogether regarding the mining and exploration activities, we see that the positive effects or attitudes are against towards mining in economy. It brings benefits to economy. It brings benefits to being independent in resourcing, and it brings positive effects in employment in the community, and some less positive, but still positive in infrastructure. While again, mining, they see totally negative effects of mining on the environment. And whether mining is accepted in the community or not, it varies. It's around neutral. And what are the key conclusions that we got out of our survey is the positive ones. First, that again, the employment and independency of the mining resources and economy benefit a lot, and local infrastructure also. But we also asked them how they perceive the novel technologies borne by either drones and helicopters. And they don't actually mind that much about those things flying above their heads. While if we look at the negative impacts or perceptions, of course, again, environment is the one that it's the most seen as being in the negative, while some people see drones and helicopters as a sort of noise source or invading their privacy, which is totally understandable. And of course, that is the perception that it's not invented. And if we look at the sort of a general perception of the mining, we have a constant of about 10 to 15% of people being totally negative against mining. Wherever we did the survey, that was basically a constant. And interestingly, the citizens' trust in accepting a mining industry or handling this mining industry by the authorities is vice versa. The more they trust the mining industries, the less they trust the legal authorities. And this is quite an interesting result also. And with that, I hope I haven't been talking over time. I conclude my presentation. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Marco. That was absolutely fantastic. And you can hear all of our fantastic applause coming through to you from the other side of our microphones. Now, we do have time for a quick question. And this question, so it comes in from Victor and also being built on some of the other chat that's going on. And this comes back to the public survey, and specifically with regards to the acceptance of mining in a community where you showed that it was neutral. So first part to that question is, how big was the range? Was it a case where most people just thought it was, you know, kind of okay, but they didn't really have any opinion? Or did you have some people who were very much in favor and some people who really did not like the idea of mining? What was the range with regards to that?
Well, we have to consider that these areas are quite different from the population perspective. In Spain, the local area is very much aware of the positive aspects of mining, and the main opposition doesn't come actually from the area, but it comes from the national level. So the perception of mining in the local communities is quite positive. In Germany, I would say it's a neutral one, while in Finland, it's interesting because there are not actually any that huge local communities living there. There are, of course, and the main negative perspective was because of the deprivation of the environment. Although there are, of course, economical benefits, but the Finns like the outdoors. They love to enjoy it. And as we know in Lapland, where Sakati is, where Sakati is located, there's a strong outdoor activities going on, and of course that brought in the negative impact also.
Brilliant, thanks Marco. And just to add to that question, when you ran the survey, did you run it only on existing mining communities, or did you also include prospective mining communities?
No, we only ran it mainly in the local communities of the reference site, but we tried to cover a little bit wider scope. So we included also other representative groups from the countries that we covered.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Marco. So ladies and gentlemen, another round of applause to say thank you to Marco and his presentation. So we're going to move from Marco and looking at all of these great perceptions, etc., and some of the fantastic initiatives that are going on in Europe. And we're now going to shift gear. We're going to go back to our rocks. So yes, this is the favorite rock of this conference here. And for those of you who have been dialed in and listening for the last few days, you'll have seen that there have been a number of talks talking about, okay, when we are reporting on how much of this rock can actually be extracted, what sort of codes, etc., do we use? And so I'm now going to pass across to the fantastic Ed Sides, who is going to give us an overview with regards to the Crisco, which is the overarching body or the glue that binds all of the different codes together. What can we do here with regards to the risk and uncertainty assessment? Ed, over to yourself.
Okay, hopefully you're seeing my screen all right. Okay, great. Okay, it's a bit strange getting used to this online conferences and so forth, where I'm having to worry about the lighting in my office rather than wearing a suit or tie. Those of you who heard me talk before may know that usually at conferences and training courses, I bring along my mascot. So he wanted to put in a quick appearance here and just say he's ready to deal with all the awkward questions at the end. So, so I perhaps should have thought of a snazzier title right now. For this, but listening to, going through the talk yesterday, I thought, well, it actually including three issues or touching on three issues that have come up in several of the talks that I've been listening to. And I sort of combined those in an alternative talk title there for those who aren't familiar with terms Crisco and Table 1 and so forth. But also just from my perspective, I just say I would think of a responsible mining project as one that's properly planned and requires a proper assessment of relevant sources of uncertainty. So I'm hopefully going to illustrate some practical tools in that regard in my talk. So for those who aren't familiar with the terms, let's just have a quick run through. Crisco, this is an international group of professional organizations involved in setting codes and standards for reporting information on exploration results, mineral resources, and mineral reserves. That's particularly by companies involved in exploration and extraction, those solid minerals that are listed on stock exchanges. And for those who want to know a bit more about that, I'd refer you to the talk Ruth Allington gave yesterday, because she explained some of the concepts of that. But one very important benefit of Crisco is that the codes adopted by the bodies indicated on the map, they all use common definitions for 16 key terms. And these are included in what's referred to as the Crisco International Reporting Template. And again, this is obviously a bit of an insider thing, but if you're familiar with the template, you'll be familiar that one of the elements in the template is a Table 1 checklist, which I'm going to talk about in the rest of the talk. Obviously, the third element of the talk is risk and uncertainty assessment. Here, I'll again touch on the terminologies and what we mean by these, because what I realized in communication and listening to different people talk is we often all have different understandings of the words we use, and that's particularly true, I think, with risk and uncertainty. Well, risk, I think probably the general public, if you ask them, everyone tends to think of risk as something negative or to be avoided. But if you look at the ISO definition, it has a more general definition of the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And because the two, I think, in people's mind are inextricably linked, I've now come to the habit, I just talk about risk and uncertainty assessment rather than risk assessment, because I think you need to know about the uncertainties in order to sort of have an idea of where you may have risks. Then working as a resource geologist, I mean, uncertainty is something that one always takes into consideration. There was a blog recently by Chris Arnold who talked of resource geologists as professional reducers of uncertainty. But I'd say more we're assessors of uncertainty and try to communicate that to other people, to engineers and to management. And typically in our work, we have to balance costs and benefits of acquiring extra information against the level of detail that we require. And I think you kind of see this at the moment in terms of the health industry, where they're talking about testing and all, you know, how much testing do you do before you can rely on the results in order to make decisions? And it's the same sort of issue with the mining industry. And, you know, that uncertainty is lack of knowledge, but you can never have perfect knowledge, even though after you mine something out. So it comes down to what's the cost of obtaining more information. Then assessing risk and uncertainty. Well, if you think of risk as being more the effect of uncertainty on objectives, then you can have positive or negative outcomes. And in that sense, the opposite of opportunity, I would see as threat rather than risk. And you have reward and penalty, benefit and cost. And yeah, for instance, if you're at the exploration stage, high uncertainty may mean there's lots of opportunities represented by interesting drilling targets which merit further investigation. Whereas on an operating mine, high uncertainty may mean that there's potential threats which could affect the health and safety of people and the surrounding environment. So what is Table 1? Well, Table 1's it's a checklist of assessment criteria. It was originally introduced in the JORC Code in 1989, so it's been around for over 30 years. So if anyone's in the working in this area and doesn't know about it, well, I think you're a bit should be paying more attention to the codes and standards that you're supposed to be following. The latest version that I'll be referring to came in the Crisco template, which was issued at the end of last year, and that includes over 150 items. I'm referring to each of these items as one of the rows in the table. So there are now over 150 items of general interest, and there are additional ones for specific commodities. And you note the text at the top says that Table 1 is a checklist that should be considered. But for myself personally, for the last 6 years, I've been using it in a different manner, really as a framework for assessing risks and uncertainties in the context of mineral resource and mineral reserves estimates. And I'm going to illustrate this in the next slide. So this is a portion, an extract from Table 1. That's the part that covers sampling techniques and data, which is namely to do with, you know, what are the assay data? That's the measurements of the ore grades, you know, how much percentage copper or how many grams per ton gold we have in a deposit, and what laboratories are we using and what confidence do we have in the laboratories. Personally, I think a lot of people just have got in the habit of using Table 1 just with a purely checklist mentality, and they then tend to forget why particular items have been included in the table. So what I found it very useful is adding some extra columns on the right, which are the potential source of risk and uncertainty and the measures used to assess those risk and uncertainty. And for instance, in case of analytical results, you know, source uncertainty might include, is the laboratory we're using, might be biased and unreliable. Well, then we couldn't rely on the results very well. Are the results reliable in terms of accuracy and precision? And then how can we manage those uncertainties? Well, we do things like we use independently certified laboratories. I suppose in a way we're then relying on some other organization to monitor the laboratory and the laboratory to have its own internal controls. We might send check samples to another umpire laboratory for independent checks. But you know, what I feel is people have forgotten that when we report on the results obtained, we should always remember why those items are in the checklist. And I think if you go through the table, you know, you'd find that 80 or 90% of the items in there you can link to a potential source of uncertainty that would affect your decision making. And I've been using this approach for several years to provide mineral resource contributions to project risk registers. Typically in these large mining projects, you have multidisciplinary teams, you have mining engineers, process engineers, you have people doing the environmental baseline studies and so forth. But using this type of approach, it helps communicate the geological concerns to the engineers and to mine managers and decision makers so that it can incorporate those uncertainties into the decision making. And in such situations where I'm using it in that way, then I add on extra columns which are for likelihood and consequence, which is a sort of fairly standard risk assessment approach, and the typical risk rating matrix where you multiply risk, likelihood and consequence of an event occurring to get an overall risk rating. And if you do a Google search, you'll see, you know, thousands of images of this sort of matrix. Now, whilst it's a bit of a simplistic method, I think it is something that's recognized and understood by a lot of people. And in that sense, I think it helps communicate with a broader audience rather than just within one's own particular area of expertise. And the next slide will show an example where this was used on a particular, this is a case where we used this approach on a technical audit where there was a joint team of geologists and mining engineers, and we were having, you know, multiple people going to multiple sites with this, which were controlled by the same company, and they wanted us to assess, you know, the reporting procedures and the reported mineral resources and mineral reserves in their different company operations. And the review focused in particular on, because if you're doing a risk uncertainty assessment, you have to first establish the context you're interested in. In this case, it was issues which could result in a material misstatement of the publicly reported mineral resources or mineral reserves. And in particular, trying to identify whether there were any misstatements of the tonnages or grades, or, you know, misstatement of the confidence categories. Those are the, like in mineral resources, we talk about inferred, indicated and measured, which are different levels of confidence. That tends to be a bit subjective, but if someone, you know, is overconfident, they may put everything in measured and say, well, no further work needs to be done. Whereas someone comes along later and says, oh, there's a lot of uncertainty here, you need to do a lot of extra work. So it can affect management decisions. And the results of that project showed very quickly, if you compare that, what's on the screen there, you can see project 2 stands out as having a very different sort of risk profile to the other 2 projects. And in particular, it has far more identified risk uncertainty issues. It has a larger number of information gaps as well. Some issues you find, well, they haven't collected any information. If no geotechnical or hydrogeological studies have been done, you're more or less guessing about those parameters in the project. And they had, in this instance, there were 3 what were regarded as extreme threats. In fact, one of those, or 3 issues. One of those was in fact a threat. One was considered an opportunity, and the other is an area of unacceptable uncertainty. So, you know, but they were highlighted as that. But anyway, moving on to conclusions. Well, on the right here are the items from the current CRISCO template, and you'll see that it has split table 1 into multiple sections, the first 9 of which apply to every project, and you'll see the number of rows in the table are summarized there on the right. But I think that the codes and standards could be improved by there's very little actual guidance on uncertainty and risk assessment, even though that's one of the main reasons for having the codes and standards. The number of mentions of risk has gone from 2 in the 2013 template up to 22 in the latest template, but it's perhaps still a little bit limited. And I think also, if we're using table 1, it's not enough just to use it as a summary and put down every item, even if there's some of the codes refer to use it on an if not, why not basis. Well, you know, that's still not obliging the person using it, the competent person, to pull out and make clear to readers who may be investors or management, which are the more important risk uncertainty issues, which are the ones really which merit spending more work and money on. And it would also provide a framework for adding extra items for new areas of concern. We've probably heard people talking about modifying factors before. In fact, things like that are buried in technical studies. And, you know, for those perhaps outside the area of doing this work, you'll be surprised, well, there's no specific section on waste management, particularly given that some of the most public issues with mining have been recent tailings dams failures and stuff. There is mention of tailings in there, but it's buried within the technical studies side of things. So perhaps if we want to highlight particular issues or ensure industry pays particular attention to certain topics, then they should have their own entry in the thing. And perhaps to make it easier then for management and investors to compare things, we could have some standard sort of dashboards to display in a visually understandable way how the different profile of different projects are. And so to conclude, hopefully I've left some time for questions, but just to share with you how the name and logo of my company, which I set up the end of 2016, are linked to the topic of uncertainty and risk. And I think, you know, particularly for me, I think often people overlook some areas, there's no information, and they think, oh, well, there's no uncertainty or risk. But if you've got no information, you've got a huge amount of uncertainty, because it can be just tossing a coin to guess what's in that area. And so there we are.
Brilliant. That's absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much, Ed. And a massive round of applause to you from everybody around the world. Now, as per usual, we have a range of questions coming in. And the first one is, you mentioned waste management perhaps being one of those areas that's a little bit buried within what's required from the different codes, etc., and the guidance. Other than waste management, are there any other specific areas of risk that you think might need to be elevated or given a bit more focus?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I tend to come at it from the geological perspective, but it's really what, you know, is what is driving is what are investors and management, and obviously, you know, from the whole point of this conference, the environmental, social, and governance things are there. They are in there, but it's perhaps, you know, we perhaps need a wider discussion of, you know, of what issues people think should be going up. But really from the codes and standards really developed largely from the perspective of geologists and mining engineers. And it's, as I said, it's really to highlight and identify areas where you need to spend more money on. Obviously, permitting these days requires an environmental and impact assessments and so forth to be carried out. So that's part of the project timeline, is making sure baseline studies are done in time. And you know, once again, I think it's useful to have some of these issues in at the early stage, because people often forget. You'll have companies talking, oh, well, we're going to develop this mine in a year's time, and you say, well, how long does it take to complete environmental and baseline studies? And they say, oh, well, that's going to should take at least a year, you know, and then you have to prepare your report and submit them. So I think highlighting things early on, make sure you get them built into the plan for the project development. And I'd like to say specific issues, but you know, everyone will have their own particular perspective on it.
Yeah, so I guess there's an aspect of managing expectations there as well. Then if you build some of those bits and pieces in earlier on, in terms of preparing people for where there is perhaps more uncertainty that you're seeing up front. So therefore there may be some showstoppers with regards to that project as it progresses to a more mature stage.
Yeah, well, having started my work doing mineral exploration in rural Ireland, what you find out is you're often the first contact with people on the ground when you go and ask for a farmer for permission to drill in their field or whatever. So, you know, if people create tensions with local society early on by just not respecting, you know, farmers say the simple thing, leaving gates open, you know, like if you're walking through the countryside, you know, you immediately start, because it may come back to something as simple as that early on, that people object to it because of, you know, simple personal interactions on the ground. But in other times, I mean, I've heard other projects where sometimes it's a local business owner is objecting to a mine starting because people would end up having the opportunity to be paid better wages. And, you know, sometimes people have hidden agendas in objecting to projects, which you need to be careful of that as well.
Great, thank you very much, Ed. And there are more questions coming in on both Q&A and YouTube, but I'm just going to go to the question that's sitting here on YouTube for the moment, and that's from Richard. And he asks, Ed, do you find that Table 1 is often used instead of a good technical report rather than a supplement to it?
Well, no, well, I mean, I think the problem is that's essentially the route that JORC took. They said people can do a Table 1 summary rather than, you know, have a commitment to do a full report. When I'm doing training courses, what I tell people is because I usually give them the example of the technical report in Canada, the NI 43-101 technical reports, and I say, I find it easiest, start with Table 1, and you can kind of do a mapping of Table 1 to which sections of an NI 43-101 report they fit into. But if you've kind of got your summary prepared in Table 1, particularly thinking on the importance of uncertainties and risk, it makes it much easier then, because you immediately have, say, highlighted in red the really important ones. So you say, when I'm talking about assay data, I'm going to have to mention the fact that they used an inappropriate analytical method, or they had a highly biased results from the quality control sample. So I don't see the two. I think there was a deliberate decision in Australasia not to impose the requirement for technical reports, but, you know, formal technical report. What I think the codes would be much better at saying is just impose people to actually use Table 1 or whatever, or the technical reports, but make clearer where the risks and uncertainties. You know, if I'm going to report, I'll look at the executive summary, maybe go to the conclusions, then I try looking where in this report are they talking about the risks and uncertainties. And you know, that's the problem is there's a lot of managers say, well, you know, we don't want to highlight risks and uncertainties, you know, just pretend everything's perfect. I think, unfortunately, if you do that, then they don't put in any budget to actually properly address the risks and uncertainties. And you know, that to me is more important. So I don't see it an either or. I think Table 1 is very good as a kind of checklist and, you know, mental checklist to identify and highlight the items. And then if you've got it completed in a proper manner, it makes it much easier then to write your report at the end, because you just automatically cross-reference with your Table 1.
Brilliant. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please put together your virtual hands to say thank you very much to the wonderful Ed. Thank you very, very much. And of course, his little helper. Brilliant. Thanks, Ed. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're now going to come from the wonderful Ed, and we're going to go to Cornwall, to the lovely Frances. And Frances is going to talk to us about, well, yes, it's not just the mining that needs to be responsible, it's also all the way through into the manufacturing side as well. So as you can see here, as she shares her slides, Frances is going to be talking to us about how do we get it right from the start. Frances, over to your lovely self.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. So can I just check you can hear me and see me nicely? Is it?
Yep, it's perfect.
Good. And thank you very much indeed to you and Rose for inviting me to talk. I'm really enjoying the format of the conference and all the lively and really interesting discussions. So I put this title on here, Sarah, and of course I can't really do it justice, but I thought it might be nice to make some conversations, because of course when we're finding raw materials, it's the manufacturers that we're really trying to reach. That's what we're doing, is producing raw materials for people to make things, and more they're interested in where the stuff is actually coming from. And so I just want to talk about some of the things we've been doing as geologists, because we are there right at the very start, and what can we do to help make sure that the things we make start off their life in a responsible way. And of course, as we need a wider range of elements and more mined materials than ever before in order to decarbonize, as you can see this really pretty graph that everybody uses from Volker Sepp and co, there are lots of nice jobs for geologists to do, to go out and think about the geology of rock types that we haven't been able to research so much for ore deposits anyway before. And that's lots of nice minerals and rocks to look at and to try to understand them better and make new geological models. And of course, what we need to do now is not just simply go through this process of finding it as geologists, working out how to mine, how to do the mineral processing and the extraction, but we need to put this everything we do in this cocoon of environment and social responsibility, which is what everybody's been talking about this week. So we've been doing some work, particularly on the rare earth elements. And I'm going to show how we are trying to kind of join up some of these issues. So this diagram here, I don't know if it looks a bit complicated when you first look at it, but here I've put the geology at the top. So this is what we would be looking at in making geomodels or doing the first stages of exploration. But of course, although we often talk about behaviors when we're thinking about responsible sourcing, there's an awful lot of geological characteristics that really affect directly how well the minerals will process, so how much waste there might be, how much energy will be used, and therefore what will the carbon footprint of the operation be, how much water, of course. Is it a big low-grade deposit where you're going to have to move loads of rocks and make a big hole in the ground? Is it a small high-grade deposit where you can get a lot of material out for a small hole in the ground? Is it not a hole in the ground at all, etc., etc.? And so I think that a lot of these characteristics really do deal with what are measured later in responsible mining indices, and so we can start to think about that right at the beginning. And here's my Zoom montage, if you like. So my Zoom canvas of alkaline rocks and carbonatites. And then as geologists, this is the world that we live in. And I think Catherine Goodenough has already given a very nice comparison of some of the different ore deposits for rare earths and their different characteristics. And of course, we could all talk for hours and hours and give you a whole hour-long lecture on process mineralogy of rare earths or potential wastes from rare earth deposits and things. But that's no good when we come to make geomodels. We've got to somehow get all this beautiful Zoom canvas and hours and papers worth of information into really short, sharp indices and measures that can go into our geomodels. And so this is for our high-tech Alcarb project, a Horizons 2020 funded project. We were making a mineral systems model on that with Graham Banks at Gaius in Denmark. And he made us, he was very nasty to us. He stopped us with that big Zoom canvas and got us right down to thinking about what are the risks, how do the rare earth minerals processing characteristics affect the favorability of the deposit going forward in this mineral systems approach. And so that links nicely to the previous talk, looking about the risks in table 1 and so on. And so we have to go right from all of this huge amount of information. And the only way we could do that was to get all of us together, consultants who are doing it for real and the academics, and actually try and get things down into just these little boxes here. And you see we've got favorable, encouraging, you'll recognize these indices, neutral, there's a risk, and then questionable and unfavorable. And Sarah, because this is going to go up on the website afterwards, I didn't want anybody coming, and it's not formally published yet, I didn't want to get sued by people not wanting their seeing their deposits in this bottom category. But of course, with new things like this is rare earth deposits here, particularly looking at alkaline rocks and carbonatites, and questionable for these odd things that are high-tech elements that are new things that we haven't mined so much before, is actually pretty good. And when you do these risk assessments, you'll find that a lot of stuff comes straight out in there because it's just a different mineral rock combination that hasn't been looked at before. And so you can see on here something like bastnasite, which is a mineral that's one of the most common ores of rare earths, where it's been mined for years and is well known in calcite carbonatite, that would get our green. And then where people are developing totally new things, that would come down here, or right in the unfavorable if nobody's actually done it before. And this is really useful. You can plot that up with mineral systems, or you can immediately get some idea very quickly within a couple of minutes of where your deposit, if you're looking at a new deposit as an exploration geologist, sits in there. So that's condensed, I would say, reasonably well. And then we're trying to put this into a new kind of model along the lines of the kind of models that you'll see in textbooks. And I've got here Mike Labar, 1977 model for an alkaline system and carbonatite. So that's a drawing. I should put a little hole on there and then you could have your mine, Sarah. Actually, the mine would be down here somewhere. So maybe that's my effort I'm going to send in. And what that translates to today is 3D PDFs. So the British Geological Survey will be producing these. They're not available yet, but Charlie Beard, together with Catherine Nima and all of us on the High Tech Alcarb project, have been making these. And here's all the geology. I think I'm showing that with the mouse now. But how do you get your environmental and even through to social characteristics on that? And we found that was actually really hard to condense the geology information and get this other stuff. And so we resorted to these pop-up boxes. This is Ema's handiwork making this nice. And so on here, you can see the size and grade, and this gives you some idea of the amount of material you'll have to use. So we've got it doesn't say this will be a responsibly sourced rock if you mine it or not, but we have been able to get some characteristics on. So here's the kind of minerals that you would find from that Zoom montage has gone right down, and our risk assessment just tells you there whether it's in development, like this one here, for eudialyte, whether it's well known and mined already from different places like xenotime or pyrochlore or monazite. And so we're beginning to be able to put some information on here. And I have to say it's not perfect yet. We haven't been able to fit in radioactivity. And when we do this for carbonatites in a few weeks' time, then we want to be able to put that in, because that's the main social issue, I would say. We're writing about that at the moment, is whether carbonatites and alkaline rocks will produce radioactive ores. And that's what we find people are most interested in, but we haven't got on that on this pop-up yet, but hopefully we're getting there. So quite difficult to keep the environmental and social in there when you've really got a constrained way to show your information and only a small amount of space. So now I want to just show another way that we've been moving environmental and social aspects, especially the environmental ones, into the exploration stages. So our geomodels would be down here. This is what the geologist would read when they first get interested. So we wanted to be able to assimilate those things in just a couple of minutes. But then what happens as you go through these stages? And we've been looking at life cycle assessment as a technique, because coming back to this manufacturing theme, big time, that's what manufacturers and retailers and everybody is using. They're using the LCA technique to assess the environmental performance. And mostly in mining, there's not very much of that done, but if it's done, it's on working mines. And what we've been doing, and this was Rob Pell, who's already spoken at this conference with Minvero, did for his PhD, was to work out how to move this LCA right forward in the process, so that during exploration as geologists, we can get one of these LCAs done and look ahead to what the environmental performance of a deposit will be. And here is one that was done, and this was done by Rob, and it was done from a pre-feasibility study, NI 43101. And so these weren't our numbers. So it means that any investor, anyone who's interested in a deposit, can go to these technical reports, and it's likely even at pre-feasibility stage, there'll be enough information that even if the company hasn't done it, you can do it and have a look at the environmental performance that's likely for this deposit. And this very complicated graph has kilograms of CO2 on the y-axis, and then the 45 years of projected mine life along the x-axis has all these bubbly numbers and graphs, and this is showing all the aspects of mining and processing and its contribution to the CO2 that will be produced from this mine if and when it works. And so first of all, anybody from outside can assess it. If this was done by the company, they could present it themselves rather than waiting for somebody else to do it. And when it's done with the company, of course, this is an ideal opportunity to have a look at what the environmental performance will be. And then at pre-feasibility, you've built precisely nothing, of course. There's oodles of room to go and modify what the mine will look like, what kind of power source you'll use, how you'll recycle things, and make sure that this environmental footprint is kept as low as possible. And I think that's really where LCA comes into its own. It's a lovely way of looking forward and being able to design your mine to fit an environmental footprint as well as an economic need that you have to make money. And so using LCA, this is a way in which we can join up from here we are in raw materials. And I really like this diagram from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, because look, it even has a line on this particular version between mining and the rest of the virtuous circular economy. And we're completely divorced from these people. And so this is the next thing we're looking at. And LCA really helps with us with that, I think, is not to be divorced from the rest of the manufacturing cycle. We need to be in there. Instead of seeing school textbooks and things and say, you know, we need raw materials for manufacturing, but mining is very environmentally damaging. What about seeing if we recycled more? What a pity that we wouldn't need to mine so much anymore, because mining is so important for sustainable development of communities. And so that's our challenge, isn't it? Is to find ways to join up and be seen as raw materials providers. And I think we need to make best friends with the recyclers and use things like LCA and sustainable development to do that. And I just put this slide in at the end to show that it's not just thinking about Africa and Australia and Canada. As we've heard in some of the talks at this conference, we're doing it right here in Europe. And that's a great challenge when it's on your doorstep, even in Cornwall, right on my doorstep, is to think about how we can produce those new commodities like lithium and so on in the most environmentally and socially responsible ways. So here we go then, there's my summary of roles for geoscientists to get as far as possible in not only producing the technology raw materials we need, but in really helping manufacturers achieve responsible sourcing. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Frances. Absolutely fantastic, as always. So massive round of applause from all of us on the far end of those microphones. Now, as per usual, we do have a range of questions coming in through the different channels. And the first one I'm going to put to you, if I may, comes from Karen Nash, who you will see she's asked some other questions as well, and she's very much an expert in this area. Karen asks, given that the environmental and social studies are costly and privately funded by specific operators, how difficult has it been or will it be to then obtain site or deposit specific information that will then be freely shared in your models that you've discussed here?
Oh, that's quite complicated. So she said, given that they're costly, how well, of course, if you looked at that Bear Lodge graph, that was produced from a NI 43-101 report. And of course, they're brilliant because they're available publicly free. So once the company was just doing its normal work to produce the NI 43-101, it didn't do anything special in that report at all in order that we could do the LCA. So I think that's an important point, is when you get to that level of technical report, we could immediately take that. I think if I could just answer a slight, I don't know if this is quite the right question, you might have to ask it to me again, but if you, that took Rob Pell in his PhD a long time to do that LCA. Garbage in, garbage out, of course. It may look like numbers, but if they're the wrong numbers going in, they can get anything out, and then people believe it because it's a number rather than just somebody saying something. And so what really we need, and I know this is something that Rob's looking at, is how do you get a nice LCA light, if you like, technique that produces useful numbers that can be compared with each other, but won't cost junior exploration companies and things so much money that they can't possibly do it. So in order to do that kind of modeling, people are already producing the right information, and then we just need LCA parameters set up so that they can actually do that kind of modeling without having to employ a consultant for months and months.
Great, thanks, Frances. And just, I guess, to build on that, and perhaps ask the second part to Karen's question here, which is saying, seeing as it's often, say, those junior mining companies who are paying for the likes of the life cycle analysis to be done, what happens if actually during that analysis you don't get the right answer? I.e. it throws up things that perhaps you don't want investors to know about necessarily. And this also brings on some of what I think Ed was talking about with regards to the extent of uncertainty that you can often have, especially in a very young project. Do you have any comments to that?
You made that lovely point, didn't you? Well, I guess well, we did actually some modelling with a company, and it showed that the carbon footprint of their deposit, if they went with the energy source they thought they were going to use, which was the big thing that the country wanted everybody to use, that would actually be quite high compared with other proposed mines. And they just went back and they just changed the way they were using their energies, and they didn't have to go and mine somewhere else kind of thing. It didn't kill their deposit. It just modified the way that they were actually providing energy for the deposit. And so although you know, it didn't show them immediately that they were going to be the best mine in the world. It meant that before they'd spent a penny on anything, because they were still at pre-feasibility stage, they could make modifications. And of course, that's really cheap to make modifications at that time, rather than build a mine and then somebody comes along and does that kind of analysis and says, well, people aren't going to buy from your mine because, and then you've got multi millions to spend. Yeah, do it early.
Brilliant.
If it's bad news, find out the bad news early, and then you can probably mitigate it.
Yes, also known as proactive risk management. Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Frances. And for those of you who have been tuning in to this conference during the week, you may remember Ruth Allington's talk from yesterday morning, where she was looking at this cradle to grave approach, or bringing some of those aspects in with regards to quarrying. So that talk, I'll signpost you back to that one from yesterday as well, because I think it complements a lot of what Frances has been saying here today, obviously together with Rob Pell's talk from yesterday afternoon as well. So brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Frances. Massive round of applause from those of us on the other end of the phones, etc. So now, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to step away from the focus on the rocks. So some of you will be very glad to hear that. And now we're going to take a more in-depth look at the people side of things. And so Estelle, this is your hint to come off mute and begin to share your slides. Estelle Levinelli is the CEO and co-founder of Levin Sources, and she is certainly one of my go-to people to better understand artisanal and small-scale mining. And so Estelle is now going to take us through some insight to that, be it a touchy subject or not. Thank you, Estelle.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And just to say, I was the only founder of Levin Sources.
Sorry.
That's okay. I'm not sure if you can see what I see on the right, which is me and people. So I need to find a way of moving that. Have you moved?
No, so we see it's perfect at the moment.
It is. Okay, I just hope it doesn't disrupt the text. But I'm going to keep my phone on hand so I can keep my time check. So I keep looking over, that's what I'm doing. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join. And I'm really delighted to be in a morning where there's been presentations on perceptions as well, because the reason I call ASM that touchy subject is because of the very diverse and sometimes polarized perceptions we have of it. So today I can make my slides move. Yes, I'm just going to explain very briefly Levin Sources. We are a for-profit social venture, 10 this year, in fact 10 this week. 15 team members, mostly in Europe, but over 200 associates around the world. And we mostly work in responsible sourcing, responsible mining, and artisanal and small scale mining. So that's why I'm talking to you about this today, and that's just some of my team. You can't really see this, so I'm going to move myself down like that. So today I'm going to speak a little bit about what is ASM. It's like a 101 on ASM, and forgive me if you already know about it. And I'm going to whiz through it. There's a lot more, such a lot that can be said about this fascinating subject, but just really give you a flavour and a taster. And then we do very many initiatives at Levin Sources. As a social venture, we like to shine a light on issues that we can see are not being given enough attention in the policy arena, but they're kind of sitting there like an elephant in the room. So in the past, we've done stuff on artisanal mining in protected areas and critical ecosystems, on or illicit financial flows. We're founding something now on the relationships between LSM and ASM. So I'll talk about that. But also, if people want, I had prepared some slides on COVID and its impacts on ASM and how that's changing. So if your questions come to that, that's absolutely fine, that's great. So what is ASM and why is it such a touchy subject? I've got to sort out these boxes. Can I do that? Is that better for everyone?
It's been perfect all along, Estelle. Just to
Oh,
let you
really,
know.
it has?
Yes,
Okay.
it has. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just keep going. It's what I see. It's my inexperience on Zoom. So artisanal small-scale mining, it took years for us to agree a definition. And thank you to the OECD for really making that happen. Because it is, people used to say, you know it when you see it. Because it's such a big spectrum. And I think that's because mining is a spectrum, all the way from the individual artisanal miner through to artisanal miners that start to organize and work together, through to them formalizing into small enterprises, eventually into medium scale mines and so on. Apparently BHP began as a bunch of artisanal coal miners who originally went out, well, they went out looking for gold and found coal, and there you go. So anything's possible. And it is formal and informal, and I'll come to that later because it's utterly crucial. And we think about it as simplified forms of exploration, extraction, processing, and transportation. But these people self-identify as miners and have quite deep understanding of aspects of mining. It is low capital intensive, high labor intensive. There are far many more artisanal miners in the world than there are miners working for large scale mining companies. And it is men and women working in all different types of structures. Now I'm focusing here on Africa, but actually there are about 40 million artisanal miners all over the world, in Asia, Latin America as well. And in Africa, it creates 2 million direct jobs, but the multiplier effect, that was in 1999, the multiplier effect is about 5 times that as we, when we quantify it. What's interesting about this is the growth we've seen since 1999, when Norman Jennings at the ILO did his report. At that time, there were 13 million artisanal miners in the world, and we've tripled that in 30 years. And that growth is going to continue. What this map shows is just a sample of the countries where it happens and the number of individuals directly involved as miners or processors. But these statistics tend not to include the traders, the exporters, and the ancillary services that depend upon the economic multiplier effect from artisanal and small scale mining. I'm going to speak about its benefits, and then I'm going to speak about its impacts, because I think most people know a lot about its negative impacts. And here I focus on the economic benefits, but I do want to make a really important point that when you want to understand artisanal and small scale mining and the people's motivations for doing it, don't only look at the economic. There are very, very strong social motivations for people to do artisanal mining. And in my own research, I've spoken to miners in post-conflict settings who say they mine for gold or diamonds because it's a way to be respected by the chief if they find the diamond, for example. It's a path towards dignity and status, which is kind of strange when you look at the degraded conditions in which miners live and operate artisanally. But this is a strong motivation for them. For others, for young people, often they migrate away to an artisanal mining site as a kind of way to discover youth and freedom, untying themselves from the gerontocracy of their agricultural communities they may come from. I call it like university of artisanal mining, because they take drugs and meet girls and boys and have a lot of fun together, kind of like people who in the north might go to university for the same experience. Often they stay. So there are these kind of things that we do need to understand, that people's motivations are multiple often and not just economic. If you want to manage it, you have to know that. So some of the economic benefits are, in situations of poverty, cash is king and people need to eat. And in situations of emergency, like where your existing livelihood has been destroyed through an extreme weather event, for example, or a recession or a disaster, or even COVID-19, people will need to find other ways to live, and they turn to artisanal mining for that. And we often see rushes in those kinds of situations. And for the remotest rural areas, it brings cash in, which is hugely important. And it creates and maintains the local economy and keeps young people there and keeps them from migrating to cities. There's a strong job creation multiplier according to the type of mineral. Our research has shown that multiplier effect in Uganda was 0.4 jobs for every 1 miner. For development minerals, which are really industrial minerals, those used in the domestic economy for construction and things like that. And then 3.8 jobs in Kenya for gemstones, which is substantial. And overall, the economic multiplier is about 1.5 of total ASM income. And so I like to raise the question, should we be taxing the artisanal miners who are barely getting enough to eat? Or should we be taxing the associated economic opportunities, because they're really transforming this mineral wealth into other forms of potential wealth locally? issue there to manage is, of course, capital flight and tax evasion by the exporters through smuggling, which is a big deal. Coming into the global economic benefits, not just those for the producer nations, ASM really matters to mineral markets because about 20% of gold and diamonds mined every year come from artisanal small-scale mining, higher than that for tantalum and tin, a bit less for cobalt. And sapphire is an extraordinary 80%, but let's be honest about this statistic. It's been there for a while, and with larger mines developing in gemstones, that's probably needing a bit of revision. One of the reasons ASM is helpful is because, for example, when the gold price goes up, often we see a lot more artisanal mining of gold happen because people opportunistically go, brilliant, I can make some more money, and they might move out of their farming livelihood temporarily into artisanal mining. They might move out of their teaching livelihood temporarily into artisanal mining, sadly, to respond to that. So it does help where there's a crunch in mineral markets. Usually that hasn't been the case in COVID, and I can come back to that in questions if you like. Interestingly, previous to COVID, we would have said that it's marginally impacted by externalities like coups and elections. In fact, it's often encouraged as people try and raise money for their election campaigns. They will send people off mining to raise the money for their campaigns. Again, COVID has had a big impact on the viability of artisanal mining and the opportunity to actually earn money from it at the moment. And so on. I'm going to skip these next two in the interest of time. And when you think of an artisanal miner or a small-scale miner, it's not unusual for people to think of men wielding machetes in Zimbabwe doing terrible things. And I understand that because that does happen. But it's actually heavily populated by women. And in Africa, between 40 and 50% of the women of artisanal miners are women. In Guinea, it goes as high as 75%. In the work we did for the UNDP in Uganda, we took a gender lens, as we usually do in our research, and found very interesting differences within the industrial mineral sector there about the proportion of women to men being involved with different minerals. But whilst female participation is high, it's very important to state that women are often confined to the less valued and less well paid roles within the sector, including auxiliary tasks like petty trading, selling pharmaceuticals or food or water at the mine sites, for example. But there are exceptions, and there are some tremendously influential and important women leaders in ASM communities who not just represent the women in their communities, but they do very well out of it. And I think, coming back to my point of motivations, although women can often face challenges in ASM communities, and very serious ones in relation to things like sexual harassment, sexual violence, gender-based discrimination, and so on, for many of them, it is an opportunity for greater autonomy. And this is why they do it, and they take those risks. So let's come to some of those negative impacts. When you read the news about ASM, you'll often see some of these things. Yes, there are widespread human rights violations, especially in conflict-affected and high-risk areas, and very serious ones at that. There is also quite extensive environmental degradation from artisanal and small-scale mining. A lot of attention has been put on gold and the use of mercury in recent years. About half of artisanal miners are involved in gold. That's a very important mineral for the sector. But there are other issues that really do deserve research as well. Our research on mining in protected areas, 10 years out of date now, we'd like to update it, found that over 70% of protected areas in Africa are impacted by ASM. And I expect that that statistic has changed with the growth in ASM we've seen in the last 10 years, and also the broader environmental degradation. But I would like to qualify here that the work we did for the World Bank on forest smart mining a couple of years ago found that, very interestingly, the forest health in certain countries was improved. This is in certain cases, not always, in certain cases where there was artisanal small-scale mining, as opposed to where there was agriculture happening. And so there are types of artisanal small-scale mining that can happen in forests that will have a lower impact negatively, but it doesn't mean it's a positive impact is just less damaging than other types of natural resource-based livelihoods that could be happening in the same place. So it's not black and white. There are so often conflicts, and I'll be coming to one at the end of my talk, huge gender inequalities, and the health and safety is actually fortunately getting a lot more attention these days. We have tragedies happening on mine sites where there are landslides and tens of people die in one incident. I monitor the ASM news, and there are these types of incidents happening a lot. But the good news is that the market is now paying more attention to this, and therefore there's more pressure on artisanal miners trying to sell into responsible markets to take health and safety more seriously. And of course, around this, something like $18 billion worth of gold every year is produced from artisanal and small scale mining. Billions, just gold. You get a lot of dirty money flowing in and flowing out. A lot of integrity issues, corruption, extortion, and of course tax evasion as well through the extensive smuggling that happens. But again, coming back to the fact that it isn't binary, this is a crucially important point for me, and I have to talk about this all the time with large-scale mining companies who we work with, who are working under compliance regimes that are organized at, and of course mandated at the national level, that say very clearly usually that this is your mining concession, no one else can mine on it. But this doesn't mean that when artisanal miners are near your concession that it's all consistently illegal. And the artisanal miners themselves may not perceive their presence on your mine site as illegal, because they may not give two monkeys what the national law says, because the state-society contract could be very weak between governments that can be inept, as we know, and communities who are poor and struggling. So we have to understand that, because if we don't, the conflicts get worse. So this is a spectrum that we use to help our clients understand and categorize the artisanal miners that they're working with or dealing with as stakeholders, whether it's to do with responsible sourcing and supply chain due diligence, or large-scale miners doing their risk assessments and their risk management. Sorry, just looking at my notes. Yes, the point here is this isn't just about miners. This is also about the traders and the exporters. We must never forget that they're also part of this, because they are often the most important part of this if you want to influence what the artisanal miners do and do not do, and where they do not mine. And please remember that one individual miner may, in the morning, be working perfectly legitimately and legally with license on their own concession, and then at night be sneaking illegally into someone's concession, stealing their asset and laundering it under their own legal license later. So individuals can wear multiple hats at once. And of course, what we're trying to do is help move people, up, or down, let's say this register, increasingly from the criminal to the legal eventually. Very important concept is legitimate mining, and something that the OECD has helped define in their FAQs for ASM. And I strongly encourage anybody wanting to make sense of this and working in ASM management or risk management at their mines to check that out. Now, before we had COVID happen, I gave a talk at Indaba, and it was such good news. It was wonderfully exciting to be there on the stage talking about all the progress that there has been since I began working in this stuff 17 years ago. And what a great momentum we have had, this big push to formalize ASM, more dialogue at last, and inclusion of ASM in policy setting, more mining companies shifting from guns, guards, and gates, which just leads to human rights violations and costs for them ultimately, to engagement-led management, a blooming of responsible sourcing initiatives across multiple mineral categories, gemstones, gold, tin, cobalt, and on it goes. So feeling real momentum in many of the countries where we operate to support the formalization and development of the ASM sector. And then also downstream in markets, more downstream players wanting to get directly involved and solve and help solve, come with their leverage and their influence to support this sector and responsible sourcing from it, which is a shift from when the OECD's due diligence guidance first came about. There was a lot of knee-jerk reaction, very simplistically, as people said, just don't source from ASM. It's A lot of that still, but there are pioneers proving that you can. And by doing so, you can uplift what's happening locally. I think generally there's broader consumer expectation as well, particularly, you know, jewelers that I work with are obsessed with what millennials and Gen Z want, and they want authentic human stories about, you know, improving people's lives. Not necessarily that it's perfect yet, but that there's a journey happening. That's shifting what's possible upstream and what stories can be told, what compliance issues get prioritized as well. And we've seen more public-private partnerships as well. Organizations like the EPRM in Europe, the PPA in the USA, also joining forces to really tackle this. Multiple standards incorporating ASM, whether it's IRMA or RJC, responsible steel, and increasing media and sector attention. It's in fashion. A little bit different now as things are put on hold, but that's a teaser for another talk. So let me come to this point of the LSM ASM community of practice, and conscious of time, I'm going to probably whip through these in just a couple of minutes to give you a chance to ask me questions. I've been working with large-scale mining companies since 2007. My first experience was in Sierra Leone for a medium-scale mining company that wanted to understand and have a report on how it was compliant with the IFC performance standards. And they had quite innovative ways of working with the artisanal miners in the community as part of their production system. It was innovative for the diamond sector in Sierra Leone at the time. I think it's less innovative now as I've come to understand how ASM happens in many, many countries. And there are some shining lights of good ASM, LSM management, some countries and some companies really doing the right things to help these cousins in the sector work together better rather than being in such competition and conflict. But we still find with existing clients and with others that we speak with in the community and with statements from CEOs that will remain unnamed right now from major mining companies, that there's a lot of misunderstanding on what you need to do to manage this issue well. And we wanted to bring people together to overcome this. So the problem is that ASM occurs on or near the concessions of many large-scale mining companies around the world. This isn't just an African issue, it's big in Latin America and also in Asia. And it's happening across multiple mineral categories, not just gold. It presents diverse risks to mining companies and their investors. We're working with Satala on exactly looking at this issue, for example, and generates sometimes very severe impacts and outcomes, which I will come to in a second. I want to restate that, unfortunately, many mining companies feel compelled to take a security-led approach rather than a security-facilitated approach. And when you take a security-led approach, in my experience, what you end up getting is protection economies where the artisanal miners will pay off the local police to get access, or members of the mining company security forces themselves to get access to the concession, which creates a vested interest in maintaining that at the political level, which can prevent the government relations department of the mine really addressing this well. You get deteriorating community relations because, of course, there's going to be incidents of violence and having people removed from the concession, sometimes with force. You get issues where security-led people are removed in ways that the miners lose their tools and they get confiscated. And that's very hard for miners, artisanal miners, because they get into debt to get those things. And that worsens their situations and can lead to human rights impacts for them. Some mines I've been involved with helping, and there have been allegations of torture by the ASM alleging torture by the security of them in order to intimidate them, allegations of sexual extortion of the women if they want to access the mine site, and more. Yes, and all of this just makes a mess, and it creates fear for people's workers. It creates a lot of time and attention and money that has to be put into managing this and diffusing the situation once it's getting worse and worse. And what you really need to do is think about ASM right from the beginning. And this is where Sarah Caven's talk was so important. a couple of days ago, which is that at the exploration level, your exploration team or the junior company that you might be acquiring the concession from or the deposit from are crucial to building positive social relations with the ASM from the start. So an engagement-led approach. Now, all of this, if you don't do it well, will lead to production losses, as you have to, we've seen some mines that have had to go into care and maintenance because they've been completely overrun, or they've had to lose their site. We see lower investment ratings. There was a mine in Congo who lost 7% of their share price because they had about 40 artisanal miners die in a landslide when they were illegally mining on their concession. We've seen lawsuits for human rights violations costing companies millions and huge reputational damage as a result, and so on and so on. So we need to fix this. And yet at the corporate level, I struggle to often get understanding as to why this isn't just a compliance issue. And this is the barrier. Here are the barriers to why we can't change this. Full stop, ASM are just illegal and shouldn't be there. They should just go away. They don't have rights to be on our concession. So let's just get rid of them. That's one I've come across. It's complex. It's not just something that you can figure out with one little study. You need a group of members inside your mining company to be dealing with this in a committee level. That's resources, it's effort. And you have to identify and understand properly the gatekeepers in the community. I've had a mining company who the resettlement expert didn't consult the ASM community because they weren't going to be entitled to any resettlement benefits because they weren't a legal business being impacted. So what they understood about the ASM was completely wrong. They felt that if they influenced the local authorities can manage the ASM. Turns out they had a massive migrant ASM population controlled by people from countries hundreds of miles away who were the traders and the financiers coming in, ultimately financed by people in Asia, pushing the money all the way down, and the stuff's getting all smuggled out. And they had no idea that if they needed to influence this, it wasn't just the local authorities, they had to go elsewhere. So it takes investment to understand it and manage it well. The other thing I find is that, and maybe I'm wrong, I hope you'll tell me I'm wrong, is that compliance is understandably hugely important. It must come first, but it can't be the only consideration, or it can't trump the sustainability piece. And we have to get compliance departments to be just a little bit more creative and flexible to allow the sustainability team and the community engagement teams and the government relations teams to do their job on this, because this is difficult. Structural, we've seen where there's not enough empowerment of site to make their own decisions, where corporate hasn't got their act together, or where corporate wants to do things a certain way, but site is led by people who are, let's say, old school and have a particular, sometimes racist view of the artisanal miners. I come across that too, and they just therefore say there's no hope, let's not bother, and so on. And there's more. Let me move on. So what do we want to do? We want to build a pre-competitive platform of concerned mining companies alongside enabling stakeholders who can together protect the miners and their investors' commercial interests while respecting human rights and contributing to sustainable development. They want this to be really practical, generating tools and detailed that can be hopefully mainstreamed. This will do a lot for the sector, for large-scale mining companies and investors. I'm running out of time. It will also do stuff for the artisanal miners, governments, and the environment. I have all the business cases here, and I can share my slides if people want to see that. What we want is we want people to participate. We want to gather expression of interest, particularly from mining companies at this point in time, but also governments, multilaterals, industry associations and NGOs who would be keen to be part of a broader community to support this. And to get this going, we're looking for some small funding for 6 months. So I think the amount here could last a bit longer to do the design phase properly with that core group of really committed mining companies. We have quite a few already signed up and keen. We have some governments and multilaterals also on board. So we've got some momentum already, but I do want to just raise awareness about this and invite you to come and speak to me after. That's it. Sorry, Sarah, that I've been a little bit long, but maybe there's one question.
That was absolutely fantastic, Estelle. Thank you very, very much. And massive round of applause from all of us on the other side of the microphones. Now, what you will see when you come back down to earth again is you will see a whole load of questions that have been coming in on chat, on the Q&A, over Twitter, everything. So I think what I will do, instead of coming to you for questions, just in the interests of time, is to say thank you so much for signposting some of the other talks that we've had during this week. Hopefully what you will have seen here is that artisanal mining and small scale mining is incredibly complicated. It's a very emotive issue. There are, exactly as Estelle said, approximately 10 million people on this planet engaged in artisanal mining, and that compares to approximately
40 million of them doing it.
40 million people doing it, which compares to approximately 1 to 2 million people engaged in large scale mining. And thank you very much to Aldo for sending that through in the background. Hallelujah for all of this online conferencing, because it means we can pull together data sets in the background in parallel. So with that, I know, Estelle, that you said that you'd be happy to share some more resources, etc., with everybody, and that will all be posted on the website. And I think, Rose, maybe something for our next steps is definitely to include some more information with regards to the artisanal mining side of things, because it's a very complicated but exciting world to get to grips with. So thank you very, very much, Estelle. Massive round of applause again. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to go from very much our feet on the ground, trying to understand these complex social opportunities. And we're going to take a step back and we're going to go to space. Because now, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go to Dr. Gareth Morgan, who is the founder of Terrabotics. And so, Gareth, if you want to take yourself off mute now and begin to share your slides. What Terrabotics does, they do a huge array of different aspects, and I won't take too much time away from Gareth, but what you'll see here is Gareth has been listening to all of the wonderful presentations during this week, and you'll see that his presentation is all about how can we independently verify and monitor what is actually going on the ground with regards to some of these resources. So with that, Gareth, over to yourself.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Rose, also for organising such a great conference. What great content. So pleased to be here sharing mine with you all. So we all know from what we've heard and listened to this week that ESG sentiment is a growing driver for the natural resources sector to ensure more sustainable practices, better environmental, social, ethical performance all round throughout the entire supply chain, to increase transparency and traceability. And if ESG is serious, then this means thorough due diligence required by all stakeholders. That's investors, regulators, NGOs, even the communities themselves, everyone who's involved. And due diligence requires data and information, which right now primarily comes from reporting and disclosures directly from the companies themselves. So what I want to talk about today is an often missing component. How do we independently and objectively verify what's being reported? What options are there? And it's not easy when you're talking about something like mining and natural resources. It's a complex, globally distributed production and supply chains. Where the production happens is often in remote locations, and where the demand is elsewhere in the world, and then the investment and the finance again somewhere else. So often you have a danger of out of sight, out of mind, and a lot of the issues we've heard about, such as artisanal mining, etc., all of these things can be happening out of view from those who are looking for ESG metrics to drive their investments and decision making, etc. So what can we do about that? How can we create objective sources of information for a global problem, essentially? Well, Ronald Reagan famously quoted the Russian proverb back in the 1980s, "Trust but verify," when speaking about nuclear disarmament. And this could equally be applied today to this ESG reporting and data from companies. And at the time in the 80s, this actually fostered an era of spy satellites, US military spy satellites, to verify what disarmament efforts were actually happening versus what was being reported. So taking that sentiment, fast forwarding 30 odd years to today, many people don't realize is that we have just undergone a new civilian and commercial space revolution. As you can see from my chart here, from around 2014 onwards, there has been a huge increase in satellites, low-cost commercial and civilian-grade satellites being launched into space, hundreds, in fact. So, and Earth-observing satellites and sensing satellites. So we now have hundreds of these sensors buzzing around the Earth, providing us with a daily deluge of data, which gives us a new information source in a sort of unprecedented supply that we've never had before. And that's giving us petabytes of satellite imagery and sensing data per year, per satellite, which is actually an incredible step change. So that's giving us daily, weekly, monthly, objective, truly objective observations to help monitor, map, and routinely understand and even help manage environmental, social, and operational risks through time and space. Hopefully you can see a moving animation here, which actually the now very well-known incident at Brumadinho. We have an archive going back a few years and going forwards in time, being updated almost daily, and the volume of data is increasing. And this can be used for all sorts of applications, some of which have been spoken about throughout this week, particularly with small-scale artisanal mining activity. That's a big use case. We can start to track these things objectively and independently. Tailings, storage facility status, live risk assessments almost of what's happening with the environment, and growing communities and settlements that are previously unmapped around mine sites. And there is a lot of data coming from these satellites. So you could have every single mine in a portfolio being mapped for a single company, or an investment fund, a pension fund, all of its assets that they invest into being mapped and monitored on an almost daily basis to spot risks happening and evolving, and check on what's actually being reported, what's said to be done, is it being done? So this is almost like CCTV of from space of what's going on. The reporting is like evidence, written evidence provided, and this is objective CCTV of what's going on. And it's not just images like you've just seen, photographs, satellite aerial photographs. There is a whole array of sensors and satellites that have sprung up in the last few years, radar satellites that can see through clouds in cloudy regions, and even get through forest canopies. They're already in use in, not enough, frankly, in the mining sector to monitor slope stability and subsidence using the radar technology from space. Optical imaging satellites have just shown, great for land use and topographic mapping. Even laser ranging satellites that measure topographic terrain, shape and morphology, and also biomass. Thermal satellites can look at wildfires, flaring of gases, etc. And even gas sensing itself to see invisible emissions, greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, not just carbon dioxide, crucially methane, and other powerful greenhouse gases that often seem to get overlooked with the obsession with carbon dioxide. So there's a lot of raw sensing data, and that needs to all be brought together and made sense of. That's the key challenge now. The data is available, it's there, and it's coming thick and fast. So at Terrabotics, that's what we do. We take that data, what we call this new Earth Observation 2.0 era. We've moved away from the military era into a commercial era with abundance of low cost and free, in fact, data at source in many cases coming from the European Space Agency and NASA. We combine that with many other technologies, artificial intelligence, computer vision, lots of compute, and knowledge of the mining sector and the energy sector that we operate in to try and create solutions that actually make sense of this data. So this diagram here, for instance, runs from left to right. Left is what I've just described, all of that raw imagery and sensing data, but it does need to be made sense of and turned into actionable, sensible metrics or reports that people can use on the ground. And that's a chain of events where that data has to be turned into something meaningful and useful. And this is just a few little examples. Tailings dam identification. You often hear about monitoring tailings dams, but there's a lot of tailings dams out there. People don't even know they exist, old tailings dams that present a risk. So even finding them in the first place is the challenge globally. So many opportunities from satellite-based systems that are there, always on, always around the Earth, collecting data for us that we can then transform into useful information. So let me give you a quick case study of how this is actually being applied in practice. So I'm sure many of you are very familiar, I'm sure it's been mentioned throughout the week, with initiatives, investor-driven initiatives, such as the Tailing Safety Initiative that was driven by the Pensions Board of the Church of England and the Council of Ethics of Swedish National Pension Funds. So they have driven disclosures, forced mining companies, in fact, within the last year to disclose the location of their tailings dams around the world. And as you can see from their portal, they have a couple of thousand, a few thousand by now actually, of disclosures of tailings dams. But this is all disclosed and reported. So this is all from those companies that did respond to the demands for disclosures and then reported. Now, if you're serious about ESG, you should verify that too. So this is something we've actually been working on and involved in this initiative for Terrabotics. So the points you see on this map are some of those disclosures that have already been given today of tailings dams around the world. And as you can see, there's a huge array spread around the world. It's probably quite surprising to see the spread of them. That's only a fraction of what's there. So with satellite data, that gives us the opportunity to actually go and verify first, are those in the right location? So we have built a system and are continuing to build a system that trawls through terabytes and terabytes of satellite imagery through time and space, and using artificial intelligence methods is trained to spot and identify dam structures associated with mines, tailings storage facilities. And actually first start by verify what's being disclosed. Like for instance, a quick example here, location given at some point around the mining facility, but not actually the location of the tailings storage facilities themselves. And that's quite critical because in the risk assessment, if that's going to potentially breach or flood, where's that going? We need to know the location, and that location in relation to local communities, population centers, environment, etc. We have another example here in Canada up to the right, a facility that wasn't disclosed and isn't in the database that we've found, in Zambia again. So it doesn't really matter whether it's Canada or Africa. We're finding evidence of non-disclosures, incorrect disclosures, inaccuracies. And this is quite a big effort, and we're trawling through all of this satellite data to verify this. And this is enabled by this just becoming available in the last couple of years, all of this satellite imagery. So as a sort of deeper dive example as well, I wanted to share. So these disclosures that have been forced by this initiative, this is just one example from one of the companies. They have complied and declared what they've got and gone through check. And I want to draw your attention to number 17, has a formal analysis of the downstream impact on communities, ecosystems, etc. been done? Yes, done in 2005. Great, tick. ESG investor, great, move on, done. But what if we actually go and try and verify that and see what's going on at the site itself? So with archive of satellite data going back years and years, and also going forwards into the future, we can actually assess the reality. And in this particular mine with which that disclosure relates to, that 2005 risk assessment related to this green area of the community on the left that has since doubled, at least, almost quadrupled in size, the population center that we've tracked through satellites up to 2019, when we actually started this study, in relation to the tailings facilities that are actually mapped and we have the correct location for them. But the risk assessment done in 2005, as you can see, is no longer representative of the real risks to the community and even the environment around it. So with the satellite data and the analysis of that, we can actually start to highlight these things, verify them, but also update that information and share that with both all the stakeholders, the companies themselves. This was actually done itself by, this was motivated and sponsored by the company itself, this piece of work. And so sort of as another analogy and a nice example, I think, but switching to the energy sector very quickly, I will just play this and hopefully it will come through while I speak. So I mentioned earlier we have satellites that can detect gas flaring, see gas emissions, such as methane, as well as carbon dioxide, etc. And so we're able to monitor regularly through time what individual companies are doing. And here, this example, we're looking at West Texas in the US, and this was actually motivated by some New York hedge funds who, with ESG motivations, they're getting that demand from their customers to make more ESG compliant investments, to actually rank companies by how much flaring they're doing, gas flaring that they're doing in the oil field out in West Texas, and compare that to what's actually declared. And so there are state declarations. This is the black dotted line here. And then the gray line behind the actual summation of all the companies involved in this area of interest, showing what's actually happened. And we see actually reasonable fits and a few big deviations, which allows us to investigate further and also understand which companies are involved in that and create essentially a league table. So it's a new interesting times when we can actually provide this level of scrutiny and transparency. So I think I can sum up there actually. So trust, but verify. So we now have tools and Earth observation satellites and the analysis that has to accompany them to transform it into useful information is one tool that helps do more thorough due diligence and verification. If the ESG community, all stakeholders are serious about this, then this data is actually available. It's available now, and it can be used, and it increasingly is being used, to create new levels of transparency and traceability for all, and help everybody up their game and raise the bar for the industry. So I will stop there. Thank you very much for listening, and happy to take any questions.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Gareth. A massive round of applause for all of us around the world. And thank you for putting up your, your glorious videos again. That's brilliant. Just by way of time, so you've got lots of questions that have come in from the different streams, along with lots of comments, and just to read some of them out at the moment. So quote from one person on WhatsApp: "This is absolutely insane, the stuff he's showing. Wow," through to, and this comes from Ludovine, who many of you will remember gave a brilliant talk on the first day of the conference, especially around the governance area. And what Ludovine has said is decision makers simply cannot claim ignorance as a defense anymore. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Gareth, in closing.
Yes, I would just like to say actually is there's a nice little compliment to that. The name Escondida, as you see in the bottom right, is actually means the hidden one. But yeah, not anymore with this sort of data. You know, it's in the Andes or in the sort of Central Africa or wherever. You know, the data's there and it's available. It's free at source. The raw data, it's available and often, you know, cost less than a business class flight, for instance, to, you know, somewhere on the other side of the world. So certainly that's a true sentiment.
Brilliant, thanks, Gareth. And just in closing, are you seeing, I mean, if I was in the world of finance or investing or wanting to make sure that my ethical investment fund truly was ethical, I'd be using this. Are you seeing massive pull from the investment side?
Yeah, we've seen an interesting chain of events actually, and I think you can't sort of understate the impact of things like I mentioned the tailings dam initiative instigated by the Church of England, so pension funds and other pension funds, and those similar groupings have done the same in the energy sector for transition to new energies and away from hydrocarbons. And we have seen the force of that investor pressure come through the companies, where the companies themselves have then come to the likes of us and ask for help with verifying what they're reporting to add extra credibility to their reporting. And that surprised us even because of the speed with which that happened, from the announcement of things like these transitions to new energy initiatives and the tailings initiative. But that had a very quick knock-on effect within months, weeks even, whereas if you think regulation takes years to have an effect and be discussed and go through the process, this sort of impact investor pressure, we've been sort of pleasantly and surprised by that. So that's forced the companies to act, which is great. There's sort of good actors there. And then also, yes, from the actual investors themselves, there's, I think, a very mixed bag there currently. I think with sort of ESG metrics and things as well in general, I don't think there's an established marketplace there yet. That and ESG is still a small portion in the investment world, that they're not like established buyers or used to, frankly, putting their hand in their pocket to pay for this sort of stuff, you know, despite running very large pension funds with sort of billions and billions and trillions under management. So yeah, it's often low cost data in itself, and there's the capital there to make it happen if the will is there.
Brilliant. So with that, thank you very, very much, Gareth. So another round of applause from those of us on the other side of the microphones. So ladies and gentlemen, Gareth has teed us up nicely for our final talk of this conference. I bring to you the wonderful Jamie Strauss. So Jamie, if you want to take yourself off mute, without further ado, over to yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Gareth, for an outstanding presentation. And thank you for the whole Satala team and Rose for what has been a really, really amazing week. I've not watched everything live, but I've certainly watched most things on record. So well done. And I guess that's one of the benefits of coming last. You get to see everybody else's first. Maybe just a little bit of background. I called this the Junior Miners Ignore Us at Your Peril, because I think it's really important for for everybody in ESG, but the whole mining world, but also society as a whole, to understand and respect the importance of the junior sector, even though they're a much smaller part in value than the senior. So a little bit of background on myself. I have 25 years in the mining finance world. I sit on a number of mining company boards. I chair 2 remuneration committees, which is really important and really interesting at the moment with ESG, because there's greater focus on ESG within remuneration of boards. I launched Digby, and I was particularly interested with Gareth's talk, because we launched Digby, which is a mining data and research platform. It's fairly unique because we address research from a technical point of view. So it's basically trying to identify and mitigate risk early, much earlier than we've ever done before, through the provision of objective and balanced research of the key technical risks, geology, metallurgy, and engineering. But risk obviously doesn't stop there. It also includes ESG. And I would just answer one thing of Gareth's, and that is your comment on the small portion of ESG in the ESG world, in the investment world. I would say that that has fundamentally changed in the last 18 months to 2 years, not just in the world as large, but particularly in mining. And I think really this talk almost kind of brings that point together as to where we've gone. So I was asked to present from the perspective of the investor, and much of the discussion this week has been on these bigger companies and the supply chains that come out of the big producers. Not Estelle's presentation, which was so fascinating at the other end of the spectrum, and certainly has more than a few thousand people involved under her watch. And what I think is interesting is a lot of people might or may not be totally aware that there's actually 4,000 public mining companies, and I suspect the same again in terms of private companies which relate to junior exploration. And why do I bother relating to this section? The clear dominance of value and therefore ESG pollution or pollution generally and impact on society is obviously related to a much smaller number of companies at the top who are in production. But producers deplete their asset base each year by production and through production. Very rarely do they fund their own exploration to replace those resources which they effectively produce. And therefore they rely on the ingenuity, the bravery in many cases, and I don't necessarily mean that from a health point of view, but more from a financial point of view, and high risk of the junior exploration industry to discover and ultimately develop to one stage or another these projects, which ultimately then fills the potential resources to be mined by the majors in the future. The general perception of ESG at the exploration or the early developer stage is could be probably summarized through unnecessary bureaucracy, costs, and an increased risk of or an increased cost of capital. And I think this conference and the wonderful presentations that have shown a common theme for this industry, and largely, and I think there are a lot of other comments that have come on which we need to talk about, particularly the stakeholder word that was so often certainly in the first 2 days. But largely, I think it could be summarized as we need to come together. We need to improve the culture for society and environment as a whole. We need to present the mining industry in a better light. We need to present it some of the positives that come out of this, as well as the negatives and the challenges that we see. And we need to advance its processes to give better outcomes for society as a whole. And I really, I was afraid of potentially adding this last bit into it, but I think it's important that this, if we were able to do this, this would improve shareholder returns. Shareholder returns of companies below the major producers really is pretty poor. And sure, we've been in a bad 10-year period with the commodity cycle going against us, but it is not a good place for investment. And if we don't have investment, then the mining ecosystem as a whole dries up. And therefore capital and risk of capital is so important to how we do this. And ESG as a general comment is critical to that end result. So let's just step back one step and define what an investor is with regards to mining. It's pretty straightforward, but I think it's important to separate out the 3 or 4 different areas. So first of all, and not in any particular order, debt. So debt generally is long-term and probably could be said to be the saving grace of the mining ESG world over the last 20 years. Since the Equator Principles largely came out in 2003, they were embedded within almost all debt type of structures in one way, form or another. That's obviously evolved over time. So by and large, debt has incorporated a lot of the requirements which I think people want. Sure, it could be improved, but it's been around for a while. Equity is deeply complicated. It covers such a range of categories which are either relate to very short term, in some cases very, very short term, through to quite long term, but also the pool of capital from private individuals funding some of these exploration stories, all the way through to highly sophisticated private equity and institutional funds. And it's those people at the end which really have accelerated the whole ESG initiative within their requirements of investing in the last 2 to 3 years. From an ESG perspective, I think this equity pool is basically the one which is making the most rapid advance at the moment. It is from a very low base, but as a result of what's happened with society and the comments back from society, it's had a huge influence. Just look at the comments from Mr. Fink at BlackRock. Then there's a new but quite small but very focused sector, the royalty and the streaming sector, which has been a critical involvement in particularly the downturn, actually, when perhaps equity investors are not there. The royalty and the streaming industry has really filled a void. And they largely are a group of about 20 or so different organizations, and they have very similar requirements to debt. So ESG has been a pretty central part of their requirements before investment goes out. And again, I can see that increasing at the moment. And then a critical element, again, and often misunderstood when it comes down to this because of the impact this has on the ecosystem, but strategic. So major corporates basically investing in junior companies. And I'll come back to that in a second. So having understood the importance of the junior industry as a whole relative to the mining industry as a whole, and also looking at some of the players that are involved in this, what is the problem and why was I compelled to give this talk today? Other than just having a wonderful invitation from the wonderful Sarah. So RMF, Responsible Mining Foundation, which do some wonderful good work, and Pierre did a great speech earlier this week, outlined in their mapping of a total of 43 initiatives which can be incorporated. Now, I think it's fair to say, having looked at a lot of these, none of them can be readily applied to the junior sector. None of them. So at the same time, you've got to put on top of that the institutional investors are also all demanding stronger ESG within the last 2 years. This has not been gradual in the course of the last 5 or 10 years as people can ramp up their processes internally. They literally are being told, if you don't incorporate the requirements of what we need you to have, then you're not going to get any investment. And so there is a lack of framework available for a junior mining company to suddenly try and apply itself to improving its well, not only its policies and procedures, but also its culture. The almost the worst thing with regards to the institutional position is that there's no harmonization and no cohesion within the investment community either. The Equator Principles, to some extent, have been superseded by all these other 40 other initiatives. So there's no one area that all these different institutions can now come together. So from a mining company's perspective, there is a complete lack of cohesion with which they can understand how they can apply themselves. That's resulted in confusion, costs, and huge inefficiency. So I have first-hand experience of this. I'm on a number of boards, and I'm going to be a bit tongue-in-cheek at how I go about this. But junior explorer with an interesting mining project moving towards development, management have a relatively basic knowledge of their immediate requirements with regards to ESG their requirements, let alone their reporting and the wider ESG requirements. So they push back certainly for a year, 2 years, while I was banging my fist on the table to say that we need to certainly up our game here. They therefore Google ESG, they try and work out what it is, and they basically find a completely unstructured environment with no idea of how, what, where, or when. So that's the first-hand experience, and that's leading to a lack of efficiency in trying to take their policies, their procedures, their culture forward for improving the environment, the society, and business practice as a whole. So it's imperative that we bring this junior sector on board. We need to encourage management and boards to embrace and ultimately change culture. Many companies are doing wonderful things, and I see that particularly in the current environment with COVID. Not particularly looking at any one company, but Adventus, which I just happen to be aware of in Ecuador, has done some fantastic things. They need a reporting structure that can allow them to not report these individual things, but to track their positions and go forward and to be embrace and move that culture forward. It must not, and it really must not be like IFRS in the accounting world, which is hugely complex, or 43101 and JORC and everything, in itself complex, and to some extent the reasons why I started Digby, to allow technical issues of mining to be better understood by the lay people. If we are to succeed, we need a relatively simple, straightforward process which will bring these companies and these management and boards on board, change culture and embrace. As Mark Kutafani, the head of Anglo-American, said, companies should aspire to being a welcomed guest in a community. And if we can achieve that, then we will likely have achieved good communication, good policies, and positive action. If we don't achieve this, I probably don't need to explain to all of you exactly the implications, but certainly investment won't flow to the sector. Large mining companies will be afraid, and I think this is one of the key things. They'll be afraid of taking over junior mining companies. What is in the cupboard, which they don't know, which will then impact their own scorecards, which will then impact potentially their debt ratings, their cost of capital, and all the other implications that goes with them. It will mean there's probably going to be greater evidence of supply shocks over the longer term as exploration companies fail to achieve investment and therefore fail to go out and make these wonderful discoveries. So I think, I'm not quite sure my time limit on this, but I think that probably pretty much covers what I wanted to try and get the message across. This junior sector is critical. It does not have a good name. We all know that, that's not a surprise. But I'm confident that if we can bring all the wonderful good of what so many presenters this week together and make an appropriate structure for the junior industry to apply itself and to report to, then I think we can find greater confidence, we can find better means of going forward, and ultimately, which must be the goal for everybody, and from your wonderful conference, Sarah, is we can find a better society and a better environment. I would just finish on one final point, as I'm hosting the Mining Beacon ESG After COVID event on Wednesday next week, a webinar which is available to anybody to dial in on. It will be particularly interesting after this because it's touching on one or two areas that haven't been touched at here. And particularly one of the questions that's going to be highlighted is how should management get awarded through bonuses as a result of ESG? And that always brings out questions and temperatures probably rising. So it might be quite an interesting presentation for people to watch. So I'll hand it back to you and happy to answer any questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jamie. That was absolutely fabulous. And thank you so much for bringing a slightly different slant to the week, but also serving to sum up really nicely a lot of what we've heard over the past 5 days. So round of applause from all of us behind our muted microphones. Now, in terms of questions, I don't want to steal the thunder from the session next week, but just to throw it straight back at you, and this has been a question that has come in, which is around how should those leaders be remunerated or rewarded with regards to all of this? What is some of your insight to that without spoiling, obviously, your event next week?
Well, I think I think it is a great question. That's why I put it on the agenda for next week, I suppose. But I think actually to be slightly boring about it, but to answer it in reality is with the benefit of my chairmanship of not only two reviews, two remuneration committees I'm on, but both of them having just had a 5-year review and having had outside consultants giving us advice, one in Canada and one in the UK. ESG is now required to be part of, or is encouraged by government and by corporate governance to be part of a remuneration structure on the short-term goals, not so much the long-term goals, so the one-year goals. Clearly, health and safety has always been there to some extent or another, so that doesn't change. The problem which we've had is the ability to objectively score, or objectively to basically objectively score that ESG. And I think that one of the problems that we have with mining ESG as just a general thing is, if you look at Sustainalytics and MSCI, which are the two key global players in the ESG scoring world, is mining just gets a negative score. So it's very, we need to basically find more metrics and mechanisms in order to find continuous and improving scores that can be then applied, which can then go into scorecards for boards or independent committees to then review. So the problem is there is a lack of objectivity to what we've got at the moment, particularly at the junior mining sector. It's easier at the senior level, where you can focus on lost time injuries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But at the junior area, it is a more difficult process from an objectivity point of view. And that's something that I think we need to try and focus on. But ultimately, yes, ESG is going to play a bigger part of, and ESG is not just health and safety now. It's very much, as you've worked out this week, it covers so many different areas, and we need to make sure that that is incorporated to some degree without losing the obvious focus of strategic goals for these companies as well.
Brilliant, thanks Jamie. So just to that final question with regards to the objectivity, is that something where perhaps rather than leaning on those junior miners to say that they have to spend an awful lot of time and money reporting numbers sort of downstream, as it were, actually we need to be looking at so for example, just as Gareth gave an overview for the previous talk, we can use things like satellite derived information. We can use things like gold fingerprinting, which is something we heard about yesterday. And we can also use things like nature metrics. So we heard from Kat earlier on in the week in terms of looking at what is the biodiversity in the area. Is this something where actually we need to re-look at where these data sets are coming from to actually try and get that objectivity?
Probably ultimately yes, but I think we need to go back one step. I think we need to start off with baby steps, and I don't mean to demean everything that's been said this week, but a lot of that has obviously been focused on the major, or on producers. I think we need to encourage management and boards to embrace ESG as a whole, which will ultimately change culture and lead to improved well, as Mark Cutifani says, ultimately to lower cost of capital if it's done properly. And if we can do that, then we make so many wins along the way. So I think the importance from a remuneration point of view of finding objective metrics is to keep it simple at the beginning, and ultimately to move this thing forward over time. Because at the moment we have much of the sector, obviously not the developers who are actually going forward in development because they're incorporating things in their economic studies, etc. But below that level, there are so many things which are relatively small, many of which are already being done, but they're just not being reported. They're being done because of host country requirements or anything. And we just need to basically bring that together in a reporting structure that can be understood better and then tracked year over year, and make it, to come back to your objectivity point of view, if we can have board approval of these things, in other words, there's a weight of responsibility behind this, then I feel as though you can put some weight and some strength and some conviction into this, which allows that objectivity to move forward. But let's not make it too complicated. We're trying to move away from bureaucracy while accepting the fact that we've got procedures and policy to be put in place.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Jamie. So round of applause from everybody for the wonderful Jamie Strauss and for your fantastic insights. Thank you.
And thank you.
Brilliant. So, ladies and gentlemen, that takes us now into our final summary of what we've been through, what we've experienced over the last week. And I don't know about you, but I think I can probably speak for Rose and myself. Our brains are certainly filled with fabulous ideas, be they good or not so good. Lots of ideas in terms of actually how do we truly make a difference with regards to ensuring that our raw materials that we need, be they rocks that look like this, how do we make sure that we can find these, extract these, process them, buy them and sell them, so that they end up in bits of kit like this, which are of course incredibly useful for all of us around the world. How do we do this in the most responsible manner possible? Now, you will have seen in the background, depending on whether you've been watching on YouTube or in Zoom, Rose and myself beavering away in the background. Also, of course, we've been helped with by the likes of the wonderful Aaron, who's been writing a blog for this morning's session. All of these blogs have been pushed out on LinkedIn, so please do feel free to tap in with them, engage with them, discuss some of the perspectives that are being shared there. But also in the background, Rose and I have been attempting to pull together some of the thoughts that have come through over the course of this last week. And if I now just attempt to share my screen to see if I've learned something with regards to how Zoom works over the last week. You can see here, this is the slide obviously that I showed at the beginning of today's session. So our mine perspectives, or mine our perspectives, this leveraging off Mark Rakovides' talk yesterday that he gave, where he said, it's not mine, it's our. So how do we begin to change that scope of thought with regards to mining as a whole? And of course, we then launched our little challenge overnight with regards to asking you to just take a scrap piece of paper and to write down what do you think, or draw a picture as to what comes to mind when you think of a mine, what actually comes to mind, and to invite your partners, your children, etc., your grandparents to join in with this challenge. And yes, you have responded, which has been truly brilliant. So what we have here are just some of those pictures that have been shared with us. And you can almost begin to try and work out, okay, so who is this person who has drawn this picture? So I know where most of these have come from, because I do know many of you who sent these in. And so, for example, this picture up in the top row here, this comes from an engineer. Okay, and you can probably tell that because this engineer has decided to draw a flow chart, which is just glorious. This picture over here, this is from a geologist, because as geologists, we generally think in 3D, or if not 4D. So you can begin to see some of these traits begin to come through. This picture down here, and Rose has very kindly censored some of what is written in that speech bubble. Now, apologies if you can't quite see this, but this comes from somebody in the UK who is talking about Margaret Thatcher and doesn't necessarily like Margaret Thatcher. So this is something here where you've got people who have been impacted by mining in the past, and so therefore have very, very strong opinions with regards to this as a whole. There are a variety of other drawings that come in here, and it's really funny to see. Well, I say no, not necessarily funny. I think it's insightful to see different people's perspectives. And it wasn't just these pictures that we got. Oh, we've got a whole host of others that have come in here as well. So you can see people doing beautiful, beautiful sketches with regards to what is going on. Some really intricate underground mines coming through here. And then this picture on the back of an envelope trying to bring in the complexity of, say, the local community, artisanal miners, what's going on with the full value chain of that mine itself, all being driven by, I think this says, person with a smartphone. So somebody actually using one of these products that comes out the far end of the value chain. We also have some little comic strips that have been sent in to us as well. So take it how you will. Yes, this is supposed to be humorous. So try and see the funny side with regards to this as well. We'll post these slides on the website, by the way. Also, with regards to perspectives, and just building on some of what Jamie said in his closing comments there. As you know, during the week, we did do a little word cloud. So this was sparked by the immense debate that was being had around the word stakeholder. Who would have thought that the word stakeholder would have sparked such a debate? And so what we did was we did a very quick ad hoc word cloud using Mentimeter, which I'm sure many of you have come across online. And of course there it was, depending on where people come from, there are different words, there are different terms that are used here, because sometimes stakeholder can be quite offensive in different circumstances. So you can see all of that coming through. And in parallel with that particular discussion, you can see over here in the top right-hand corner, this is a picture of one of my monitors during the week of what was going on YouTube. And actually this is from Tuesday afternoon, where we had some really good engagement from a group in Portugal with regards to mining and perhaps some of their experience with regards to the stakeholder engagement around them. And I think this was summed up nicely by Monica's talk, where she was talking about, can we trust you? And so depending on who is us and who is you with regards to this. So some brilliant different perspectives all coming together. And before we get into the summary, which we're going to do through a series of suggested next steps, Rose and I can't forget to say a massive, massive thank you to everybody who has helped us over the course of the last 3 weeks. So yes, it was only 3 weeks ago that Rose and I sat down virtually, of course, over Zoom, and we said, actually, yeah, let's do this conference. Let's see if we can't make it happen. And so to Rose, a massive thank you to you, Rose, for all of the hard work that you've put in. You've been absolutely phenomenal. But also a big thank you to all of these fantastic people that you see listed on the screen. Obviously, we have all of our wonderful speakers who have helped us over the last few days. So just to summarize that, we've had 65 different talks given by 71 different presenters over 8 sessions held over 5 days. And it was only organised in 2 weeks. I think we've had approximately 500 people sign up in different ways, and hundreds of other people who have watched the YouTube stream either live or following up online afterwards. We've had over 3,000 visits to the website, which again was only launched a couple of weeks ago, almost 2,000 of which are unique. And we've had 2,625 views of the different abstracts, and that was as of this morning before we went into today. I have no idea what Twitter looks like or LinkedIn looks like, but thank you so, so much for all of your engagement, because it's through this engagement and the sharing of perspectives that we're actually going to be able to make a difference and ensure that we do all of this in a responsible manner. So to the final slide that I have here, and this is the what next. And thank you to those of you who have been messaging us in the background and saying, it's always great to take part in these sorts of conferences, but you often walk away with a feeling of excitement, but then, okay, but so what? What now? And so what we've tried to encapsulate here are some of the ideas that either you have suggested, but also some of the other things that have been going on in the background. And you'll see, I'm not sure why we put this at the top of the list, Rose, but we did ask everybody if another conference was a good idea. We will, of course, send out a survey and request your feedback on this. But there's nothing stopping us from running another conference like this. We've never run one quite like this before, but I think what we've seen is that it does work. And it's a really good platform through which we can pull together people who might not usually interact with one another, and so therefore different perspectives that we might see. So yeah, if you think that another conference would be a good idea, let us know, and Rose and I and the team will put on our thinking caps and try to make sure that that happens. But we are, of course, very, very keen to integrate and work with lots of other groups who are obviously doing very similar things. So this is a case where we all need to be working together. It's been suggested by the likes of Joel earlier on in the week, suggested that we might want to look at some focus sessions, say, for example, in Africa or Latin America. There's also nothing stopping us from doing this in different languages. So we can run conferences in French or Spanish or Portuguese, etc. So we can, of course, do that. Also, and you'll see here is something that came through this morning, from the wonderful Darren. You may have heard that Darren mentioned that he used to be the chair of the special interest group for the Institute of Risk Management with regards to infrastructure. And something that has been agreed behind the scenes is that we will give a talk to that particular group, so to a very different group of stakeholders, but absolutely key with regards to ensuring that we use our materials responsibly. So we will give an interactive talk to that group at some point in time in the next little while. So thank you very much for that, Darren, and that very quick organisation between everybody. It was also suggested, and this came through yesterday afternoon, perhaps some larger scale public engagement. So this is, for example, people have been talking to the BBC, etc. What can we actually do there? And so that comes through with the likes of Nick and also Richard Harrington, etc. Some of the discussions that you guys have been having. So any support or any interaction there, absolutely fantastic. Publications. So yes, the Geological Society of London has been in touch and said, hey, do we want to put together a special publication trying to pull together some of the thoughts, for example, and aspects that we've seen this week? My feeling on this is that, yes, perhaps we have a start, but there are still lots of gaps in terms of what we've pulled together over the last week, but that's certainly a potential. Many of you will have already seen the learning materials that have been collated on the website, through to putting together some university style questions, etc., and ways in which people can make use of all of these phenomenal videos which have been created over the last week. So all of that is coming and it will be finished over the next week or so. So watch this space. I know that that page will be updated nicely. We've also got a number of different initiatives. So you will have seen that there's been a bit of a running theme with regards to the resource reserve reporting. So all of us geeky geologists on the call were very excited with this. And thank you very much, Ed, for actually your summary in a way of some of those key aspects earlier on today. Those of us who are deeply involved in this space will know that there is a huge amount of effort going into updating perhaps the environment, social governance aspects of the resource reserve reporting that's going on now. So hopefully some of the videos that we've recorded this week can provide some background context setting for people who are coming into that space or who are interested in it. Also as well, you heard Estelle talk about the artisanal soil scale mining through to the large scale mining community of practice. So again, there is a lot of fantastic initiatives that are being put together there. And if you're interested in that, I do encourage you to get in contact with the likes of the wonderful Estelle. Also on the research front, earlier on in the week, Neil Cantle, so he was our actuary who came and shared some of his insights with regards to how do you take some of that network and causal based modelling and try to use that to model what's going on in the responsibility space. And that's a case there where some of the research work that we've kicked off already over the course of this week is looking into that in a lot more detail. So I refer you back to Neil's talk on Wednesday morning. And of course, the final bit of information here is that our mine perspectives piece with regards to all of those lovely drawings. And all of this will be fed back to Anthea. So this was her research idea. We'll leave these on the website because I do believe that these pictures give a fabulous insight as to how people perceive mining and what they feel is important to them. And you'll see at the bottom there is an and ... question mark. This is something here where Rose and myself, we would love to hear all of your fantastic ideas with regards to how can we actually really make use of everything that we've collated over the last week. It will stay on the website unless, of course, our lovely presenters want to be edited in a special way. Don't worry, we're on your side with regards to this. So this is designed to be an online resource that can be used for the future and also added to as well. Because as Jamie alluded to, there are lots of perspectives that we're still missing from this wide array that we've collated this week. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen so that you can go back to the gallery view so you can see all of the lovely panelists that are still online. And just in closing comments, what I'd like to do is just to go around our panel. So if you'd like to take part in this, please switch your videos back on, ladies and gentlemen, and just ask for your closing comments. Now, these can just be takeaway things that surprised you during the course of today, or if you have any ideas as to how we can take all of this momentum that we've got forward, how can we make best use of that? So I'm going to gently work forwards. I'm going to start off with Darren. So I'm giving you a heads up here, Darren. I realise that you're perhaps newest person to this space, but you have been sitting here gently on your weekend, because of course you're in Riyadh. I just wondered if you had any words in closing, and after you, Darren, we're going to go to Ed. Thanks, Darren.
No, just to reiterate, and I'm sure others will say this, so thanks again to all those who organised it and the presenters. We often underestimate how much time it takes to produce the slides. But a big thank you. I've learned so much today, and in fact, actually, I will probably go back and look at some of the other videos the last several days as well. But no, big thank you, and that's it. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Darren. Ed, any final words of wisdom for yourself? And then we're going to go to Francis.
I don't know. It's very difficult to sum everything up. One feels one's just a small cog in the whole thing. But I suppose one thing I was just thinking of is that with that talk on the Tailings Initiative and working with the reporting codes, is that it's often one bad apple that has triggered these things. That Briex had a lot of problems, the Brumadinho tailings disaster had. So I suppose, you know, whilst we don't particularly want bad apples, we should realize it's the negative things tend to have more impact. And, you know, why isn't the public more aware that there are lots of good mines? And, you know, particularly I think of where I come from, Ireland, Navan in Ireland, and the Neves Corvo mine in Portugal, which I've also worked on. They are very important for their local communities and have been successfully operating for 30 or 40 years without any, you know, major disasters or anything. And the local communities would be aware of that, but at national level, people don't know those, and, you know, the good side, if you like, of mining tends to be hidden from the public perceptions. How do we tackle that?
Brilliant. No, thank you very, very much for that, Ed. Incredibly important. Francis, across to yourself, and then we'll go to Aldo. Oh, we can't hear you, Francis, for some reason, but you're not muted. I tell you what, let's go to Aldo, and then we'll try and get Francis working. Aldo, across to yourself, and we'll come back to you, Francis.
Well, a big thank you, Sarah and Rose and the rest of the team for a marvelous conference. It's not often that communicators get to participate in these things. We're kind of on the sidelines of the technical conversations, but I think you've managed to balance the technical with the bigger picture stuff really well, and happy to have contributed going forward. How do we go about continuing those conversations and leveraging this group to better sort of communicate the good that mining does and the challenges it faces?
Great, thank you very much for that, Aldo. Francis, shall we try you again?
I try. I've changed my not so good. Right. Okay, well, thanks ever so much. I love the format's been good. I've been emailing people while other people have been talking and saying, go and catch it. And they say, oh, I've missed it. I'll read the abstract. And I say, no, just wind back on YouTube and go and have a look. So really, that's a lesson for the future, is the flexibility of the format's great. Surprise for me was listening to Jamie's talk just now and about how he wants yet another code for the junior mining companies. And I thought that everybody just followed the IFC guidelines, and so I'm going to find out more about what he's, you know, what the important points are there. So that was a big learning point. Lots to learn in all the talks, of course, and all those nice cartoons of what a mine looks like. What I wanted to do was just rush out and go and take a picture, because I can't draw at all, of my back garden. And, you know, mines that actually either you don't know they're there, or you like them so much that you'd really actually welcome one in your area, or you wouldn't notice it's there. I mean, I think we're actually going towards the techno solution for that. There are techniques coming and different sorts of deposits we can mine, and you never know, that will be a great solution. So there's lots more technical stuff to come in, as well as all the other exciting conversations that we're having around.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much for that, Francis. And feel free to nip out now, take that picture and send it through. We'd love to see your garden. Jamie, should we come to yourself, seeing as Francis used your name in vain, and then we'll go to Marco.
Thank you. And Francis, in direct answer to you, I think you've made actually a really good point. No new initiatives, please. I think there are enough new initiatives out there, but I think the important thing here is to take the initiatives which are out there and right size them for the different levels of the industry. And I think that's the important thing. and this is not a marketing point, but follow Digby and you'll know where I'm going with this. So, but I think no new initiatives, please. I think there's so much good work's been done. There's enough content out there, which no doubt will be further improved. I would just finish, Sarah, just by seconding Ed's comments just now, that bad apples lead to negative perception. So much positive is going on in this industry. Let's be honest, with so much going on in terms of windmills, solar, electric vehicles and all the rest of it, we do produce the solutions to the world's problems, notwithstanding the fact that there are some negatives that go along with that, which need to be balanced and need to be improved. And what I would say is your conference, which has brought so much content, so much talent together, I think if we've been able to do that, react and adapt and improve so quickly by bringing a virtual conference together, then I think that in itself is a reason why this industry has so much to look forward to, from arguably a low base from perception, but we can turn that to account and make a better world that goes with that.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Jamie. Marco, across to yourself, and then we're going to go to Gareth.
Well, thanks again for letting wrap up from each of us. What I would like to emphasize is that I had a really great time this week, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I've seen so much more enthusiasm about this virtual conference that I actually get to at many live conferences. And so this is something that's really surprising, and keep on the good work. I mean, really, really nice work. And I've seen you've been multitasking. You've been talking to us, writing us emails, writing us texts, recording everything. It's just great. I would suggest one additional thing, as some of us are working in the private sector, and we do have the professional titles that we have to maintain, and we do collect points for the continuous professional development. It would be nice to have some sort of certificate of participating to such conferences, because that's something that we have to prove. And since I haven't drawn a mine, but my son did, he wants to say hello, okay? Come on.
Hey.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you for your picture. It's great.
Well, thanks, huh? I'll keep following you. Take good work ahead in the future.
Brilliant. Thank you
Yes.
very much, Marco. It's fantastic. Gareth, beat that one. Over to you, and then we'll go to Estelle.
Won't cry. Yeah, firstly, thank you very much. It's been a great conference you pulled together, and it's a really great cross-section example of the cross-section, showing the complexities and intricacies of everything that's involved in sort of responsible ESG factors that are related to mining, from artisanal mining to the ends of the supply chain, the communications, comms component. Even just today, we have that cross-section. So that's really great to see, because it shows that, puts us all in the context that we're working in. And so from my point of view, from a sort of closing remark, is that the more information, the more data that we have is a good thing. It increases transparency, and that allows us all to up our game and raise the bar. And that's it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Gareth. That's fantastic. And across to the lovely Estelle, and then we're going to go to Aaron.
I like this lovely business. Keep it up, Sarah. Thank you. It's just been so interesting. As a geographer, I love looking at things from multiple angles, and so to have all of these different points of view on mining has just been so educational. I'm going to go and find a MOOC on life cycle analysis, because I've been meaning to do it for ages, but Francis just really hit it home that it's time I did that. And I think that what you've gathered here is useful also, particularly for university students or younger people who need to figure out what could a career in mining be like. Because coming from every single discipline, there's ways to work in mining and contribute to sustainable minerals futures for us. So I really think universities should be capturing this and using it as part of their career development planning with students. I'd love to do a joint conference with you on ASM. I also would love to see, and I'm sorry for the people here that aren't British, and forgive me because you're sick of people talking about Britain, I'm sure. But because Britain has changed its place in the world, and because of the distraction that has been for many years and will continue to be in the future, Britain's role in minerals from a government point of view has been weakened lately. And as an organisation that works in many countries around the world, we don't really see a lot of British government presence as much as it used to be as a constructive partner to developing countries or to other market nations in helping make minerals more sustainable. So I love your idea of going broader for public attention on this. And I would love a conference like this on what is Britain's place in building sustainable mineral futures, to bring together those of us who are based in Britain or with interests in Britain, to attract the government into a conversation about this, to help them with their thinking as well. Forgive me getting all British centric, don't usually do that, but I see the opportunity.
I think that's brilliant ideas. Thank you very, very much, Estelle. Let's make it happen. So if anybody has any ideas to that or any contacts, etc., or is anybody already doing it, please let us know because we'd love to get involved. Fantastic. Thanks, Estelle. Aaron, across to yourself, and then we'll come to the lovely Ludovine.
Thanks, Sarah. I just wanted to say that I've been able to attend this conference in sort of two roles. So I'm a PhD student working in sort of exploration geology for lead zinc deposits. So I got to attend in this capacity, and it's been really interesting, especially today with the things Francis was saying, is what geologists can learn about incorporating sort of this life cycle assessment into the geologic evaluation of a deposit. And I think this is really important. It's not something we learn a lot about when, studying geochemistry of a skarn deposit or porphyry mineralization. Like, this isn't things that we necessarily learn, but I think it's critical to understanding mining systems in sort of the bigger picture. The second way that I've been able to attend this conference was as one of the Ore Deposits Hub hosts. And so we're an organization that's distributing weekly seminars from top-end geoscientists and mining professionals on sort of a Zoom framework like this, except maybe not as diverse and with longer talk segments. But what's really cool to me about this conference that Rose and Sarah put together is sort of the diversity and the range of experience and knowledge that's present here all in the same room every day, all week. And it's been quite amazing and really inspiring for me because it's sort of like, in my opinion, it's like the most important thing that we can do is get the experts to talk to other experts, to talk to public actors, and really, as Francis said, that for me it helps get me out of my geo comfort zone, and I really appreciated that little tidbit. So thank you, everybody, and thank you, Rose and Sarah, for organizing this.
Perfect. An absolute pleasure, Aaron, to get you out of that rock space. Absolute pleasure. Thanks, mate. Ludovine, your final words of glorious wisdom, and then we will go to the fantastic Rose.
Great. Thank you very much for this conference and this excellent panel this morning. So I've done a little bit of political activism in my youth, and one of the phrases that we hear often is you can pretend to care, but you can't pretend to show up. And I just wanted to commend you and Rose and every single one of the panelists, because they showed up and you showed up. And I think when you were saying, okay, what's next? Every single one of us has to, I think, follow your excellent example of leadership. You cared and you showed up, and the result is all of this information and all of these exchanges. So bravo to you, and well done, because this is, I think, the first next step.
Merci beaucoup, Ludovine. Thank you very, very much. Brilliant. And for the last words, Rose.
Thank you. So I think I've learned two things mainly through this. And I think the first one is what everyone said it needs so many people to come to the conversation. And when me and you were pulling this together and I saw the list of people, it was like, wow, we've really got everybody. And actually, as we've gone through this week, we've spoken, it's like we keep coming up with more ideas of more people that we need to pull in. And it really shows how complex it is to get people there and to understand something fully. So we've sat and said, you know, we need to talk to the psychologists and the social scientists, as well as, you know, all the people that we've got. And I think that's really, I think as geologists, we could be quite ignorant in that and just focus on the technical. And I think that's been a big lesson. But also, actually, what can happen when you just go, sod it, I'm going to do it. Like, this has taken 3 weeks and it was just, shall we just try and do this? And it's been amazing. The feedback that we've got has been amazing. And I think it shows that if you actually want to do something, you can, and it can be far better than you imagine. So on that, thank you everybody, as Sarah said, for turning up. But on behalf of everybody, thank you, Sarah, because I know how tiring this has been behind the scenes, how you have kept up the energy and done everything so fantastically the whole way through, whilst also doing the behind the scenes bit with me, is amazing. And you are a great role model for everybody in this. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Rose. I shall attempt to take that in good grace, but as you know, British people are terrible at receiving compliments, so thank you very much. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for all of your input, your attention, your ideas, your challenge over the course of this last week. Long may it continue, and watch this space for what comes next. Brilliant. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a lovely, lovely weekend. Round of applause, everyone. And we do weddings, you know, etc. Oh, and yes, we can do kind of different days for different nations. We do different types of facilitation. You just get us involved and we'll be there. It'd be fantastic. Birthdays, all of that. Brilliant. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a good weekend and stay safe. Cool. I will just save the chat and then I'll close it.